Welcome to Conversations with Christians. I am Kevin, non-Tradicath, and I am very excited and honored to be joined today by Caleb Jackson. Caleb, what's up?
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on. You have been one of the most highly requested guests on my channel. I've put out a series of videos on various miracles, and either in the comment section under pretty much every single one, or in an email that somebody has sent to me after I published that video, they've said, you got to talk to Caleb. You got to talk to Caleb. So I'm very excited and honored that you're joining me today.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be here, and I kind of have the same sentiment. And I'm sure we'll be getting into it in terms of beliefs and the different cases. But yeah, I've been on quite a few channels now, and I'm always glad to come on. But I think this is the first time I've come on an ex-Catholics channel, and that way, normally when Catholics want to talk to me, it's in favor of their beliefs. So I kind of see myself as like the anti-hero of that group, because some of the miracles I'll fight and support them, and some of the ones that they like, I actually will disagree with them and try to refute it. So I think it's a tenuous, it's just kind of an awkward alliance in that way.
Well, hey, hopefully here it's not going to be too awkward or too alliancy. You know, we're going to have some disagreements now. But to anybody in the audience who's thinking that this is going to be a debate, this is absolutely not a debate. This is a discussion about miracles, primarily Catholic miracles, though I'm sure non-Catholic miracles will come up in conversation, and also kind of just epistemology in general, I think. Before we go much further, do you want to address how you and I both have doctor in our name today?
Yeah, it's funny. I saw that thumbnail and I emailed you about that. I was like, you have that in there. So the reason that the doctor was on my name, at least, that comes from a screenshot from Cameron Bertuzzi's channel, Caption Christianity, which is like, I think, the first big show I was on. And Cameron's used to having actual scholars on there with doctorates. And so he, I think, just had it auto-filled in the name, or something had happened, or maybe it was just muscle memory, but he had Dr. Caleb Jackson. I don't have a doctorate. Right? I have a bachelor's, is about it. And he had that on there for probably half the show, so well over an hour, until one of us noticed it. And I was like, oh, that's awkward. And so he then changed it. But I do just, for the record, I'm not misstating my my credentials. I do not have a doctorate as much as I may want to.
And I gave myself a doctorate for the sake of the thumbnail also. So you and I are both honorary doctors we're on my channel, so I have the power to bestow upon both of us honorary doctorates. So
like knighthood, you just like declare someone.
Exactly. And if anybody ever questions you about it, just say that Kevin said it's fine, and they'll know what you're talking about.
If you say it's fine, that automatically legitimizes it. So.
Exactly. Okay, so before we dive into any kind of miracle conversations, I imagine that most of my audience is going to be familiar with you already, but for those who aren't, maybe you could just very briefly introduce yourself. And since this channel is kind of like a Catholic focused channel, I'd also love to ask you just kind of what your relationship with Catholicism has been. I know that you're not a Catholic Christian, but I would just kind of love to hear what your exposure to Catholicism has been, because I know that there is some exposure because you're very familiar with a lot of Catholic miracles.
Yeah, so I would just consider I'm a Christian author, so I've written 2 books now. One on the resurrection, which I know you said you just got, called Undead, and the other one is called Searching for a Solution to Suffering, and that one's about theodicy. And I'm currently writing a pretty large 2-volume work on miracles. It's probably going to be called Proving Prayer, but title still may be pending. And that one hopefully will have Volume 1 will be out probably this summer, or at least later this year, and Volume 2, which is more on the Catholic stuff, is Volume 2, will probably be out 2025 sometime, all wells being. But I've been working on that project now for almost, it'll be over 3 years now, January of 2021 at that point. So it's been a long time in the making, and it's been something that's really I was interested in ever since I wrote the resurrection book. But the theodicy book I did as a tangent because of COVID, and I'd gone through a lot of personal stuff, so that was kind of on my mind. But I always wanted to write this book because there really wasn't that much material out there. There's a handful of books that are relatively well known, but there wasn't one work that I was like, oh, this is the definitive work, because there were some that were really long, but they were mostly anecdotal, and there were some that had some medical documentation, but it was only like 5 cases, and and some of them, went to the philosophy behind it. So I wanted to do like encompass all of that together in one giant work and like hit every single base and combine all of these into one, basically. So that's what I've been trying to do for the past several years now, and what I'm looking forward to coming to fruition. So that's a little bit about me. In terms of my relation to Catholicism, I am not Catholic, nor have I ever gone Catholic. I was raised Baptist. I did have an aunt. Well, she's still alive. A great aunt who was married into a Catholic marriage. So she is. I don't think she still identifies as Catholic, but she has a lot of that kind of upbringing in that way. So that's the closest I've had to it. But I have Catholic friends who constantly trying to convert me. Right? I don't think it's worked yet. So but yeah. So I've had but I've been on shows. I did a tag team debate with Jimmy Akin, not against him, but with him. And I know he's been on your show on the virgin birth. And the funny thing about that one was he was defending the virgin birth through the Bible, and I was defending it retroactively through Marian apparitions, which is really ironic. It's like that you have the Catholic doing it with Scripture and the Protestant doing it with Marian apparitions. But so that's good. But I do have ties to that Catholic apologetic sphere, but I'm no means all the way there. And reasons for what that would be a whole nother show on its own, I'm sure we could do about why I'm not Catholic. Let me fix that camera there real fast. Oh shoot, hold on.
You're fine. I had actually forgotten about your debate with Jimmy on the virgin birth until right now. And I think that the reason that I forgot about it was because, and let me flesh out this thought before I just sound like such a jerk. I hated that debate. I really hated it.
It was pretty bad. Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong.
Not because of you or Jimmy. You and Jimmy were fantastic. The opposition, and clearly, I shouldn't say clearly, right? I'm agnostic. I don't think I don't think that the virgin birth is more likely. So theoretically, I'm on their side. Oh my gosh. I had never wanted more to affirm the virgin birth than during that debate. Oh my goodness gracious. I struggled to finish it, and you and Jimmy both. I hope that you guys both had a few drinks after that debate, because oh man.
Yeah, no, that was rough, and I don't want to get into the whole process there, but the one of the people so it was with John Loftus and Darren Slade, and Darren Slade I actually had a lot of respect for, given some of his writings. He published in Loftus's anthology book about miracles, but he gave a pretty resounding critique of Craig Keener's book, and I thought it was actually pretty well done. So I figured he would be a good candidate for the debate. But someone can be a talented writer and make decent points, not necessarily be the best rhetorically. So that's sort of an issue on its own. But yes, I agree. That debate could have gone a lot smoother than it did. But, we're here now, and I think our side came up on top. So at the end of the day, I'm happy with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think no more needs to be said than exactly what you just said right there. And before we go any further, the link to your Resurrection book is in the description down below. The link to your channel is in the description down below as well. But so is your... I think I linked to your miracle video on capturing Christianity, since I figured that was the one that was most relevant to...
Yeah, my channel has not been very active. I will plan on uploading more to it when the book's out. I'm going to do a video, like a chapter by chapter thing of the book, but I haven't frankly had time or interest because I've been busy writing and work and other stuff. So there'll be more on that since then, but I don't think I've uploaded on that channel for like at least a year or so now. So that's definitely check out the other shows I've been on more than that.
But let me at least say, go subscribe today to Caleb so that when he posts, you guys get notified. But then while you're at it, just go on YouTube and just look up Caleb's name, and you'll find his appearances on Trinity Radio, Capturing Christianity. Loved your debate with a tippling philosopher. Was that on his channel or
Jonathan Pierce? I think it was on Myth Vision's channel.
That's
Derek
where
Lambert.
it was. Yes.
Yeah, I'm good friends with Derek Lambert as well. But yeah.
I'm a big Derek fan. I think Derek's a cool guy.
Derek said that I was his favorite Christian, which really meant a lot to me. So.
Wow, and he knows a lot of Christians too, because he has a decent number of Christians. So that's high praise.
He's very agreeable. Yeah, no, he is.
Cool.
And then he'll make his clickbait videos where it's like Christianity destroyed, and then the thing. But he's a sweetheart.
I like him. Yeah, he seems like a good guy. So the focus for today's discussion is going to be miracles at large, with a focus on Catholic miracles.
Right.
I wouldn't mind starting on a place where I think that we already agree. Fatima. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on Fatima in general. Are you a full Fatima believer, or do you have some doubts? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Fatima.
Yeah, so I would say, generally speaking, I have my doubts on that, not because I have any a priori disagreement with Marian apparitions, but I do think that the evidence there is questionable. Now, I do know there have been a few apologists who've argued for it. There was Tyler McNabb had a paper a few years ago where he tried to draw a line to connect that with like the truth of Catholicism if Fatima was true.
Hmm.
But in general, I've found the evidence for it to be very very questionable in terms of, it's not like some of the other ones where this is a multiple event thing. Now you do have the Virgin Mary. So just for the audience, Fatima is an alleged event where three separate children in Fatima, Portugal, in 1917, claimed that Virgin Mary appeared to them and conversed with them on several occasions. And on one particular occasion, they predicted that there was going to be a miracle for everyone to see. So I think it was in October of that year, 1917, crowd of 30,000, very large. I think it was 30,000 or so, tens of thousands of people gathered there. And these children announced this to look up in the sky for a miracle. And people did, and they saw the miracle of the sun, as it's called. Now, what that miracle was is part of the contention because people saw different things. Some people said that the sun looked like it was coming closer. Some said it changed color. Some said it zigzagged. Some people didn't see anything at all. So, there's a lot of controversy behind that. And I'm not entirely sure what to think of it, but I do feel. I think the foremost point is that it's obvious from an astronomical perspective that the sun did not actually move, because that would be detectable by every metric of the way, right? Not only in one location. So you're going to have to say that if this was a miracle, then our Blessed Mother would have basically caused a mass illusion on behalf of the audience. But I feel like if you're going to get into that territory, we're saying, well, God or Mary is causing people just have a massive illusion of something that's not there. That really, I think, strikes from hunger in terms of being a little bit ad hoc, right? It's like, oh, you have a vision or hallucination that God's causing. Well, maybe He is, but if we're agreeing that it's a hallucination, it seems ad hoc to posit that it's God causing it, right? And if you already have other examples of people having mass hysteria or mass illusions of this kinds of way where people see something that's not really the way that it's reviewed, then I think that gives reason to doubt. And I do know there are other cases where people have gone to places like Medjugorje or other Catholic holy sites, and they've stared at the sun intentionally to see a miracle, and they've replicated that thing, and they usually get eye damage afterwards. And doctors have been like saying, "Don't do this because it's really dangerous." So yeah, if the miracle comes down to a bunch of people who are expecting a miracle, who you amp up in this kind of predisposition, who look at the sun for a little bit and start seeing things, when you put it in those terms, it does seem a little crass to say that this is a miracle when you have people who just saw weird things after staring at the sun for a little bit, right? So now, some people think that this could have been like what's called a sundog or some kind of weird weather aspect. That's a possibility, although at that point you have to say, how did the girls predict this, given, this is prior to modern meteorology, unless they got lucky or something. So I don't think that's the most likely. But you also have this issue of like the three secrets of Fatima, right? Where it's like there are these predictions that were given, and most of them there's either question in terms of when they were released, whether it was after the fact of an event happening like World War I or World War II, or they were things that were very broad, that were sort of, something that anyone could have predicted, essentially, like one of the world wars at the time. And I think one of them was about hell, but it's this very kind of medieval-esque version of hell where it's like we saw people in fire and demons torturing them and stuff like that, which is a very late view of hell. That's not the view traditionally held by most theologians, right? It's a very, as I said, medieval view of hell. So I think for all those reasons, I would be very skeptical of affirming Fatima. Now, I will say there are people who've gone to Fatima as a shrine, just like Lourdes, which I know we're going to get into, who have been healed in pretty impressive ways. They don't have a whole system set up like they do in Lourdes there, but people go there and claim to get healed. And there's at least one or two, I think, that are really interesting that I have a hard time explaining by that regard. Whether I think it was Our Lady of Fatima that caused it is perhaps a different story. And then you get the weird thing of, could the apparition be fake, but the healing be real? And maybe God's healing someone just out of compassion for their faith, regardless of that. You could, I think you're stretching credulity there a little bit, but yeah, there's a lot of questions, but that's my general thoughts on the miracle of Fatima.
Um, I essentially agree with absolutely everything you said. I do just want to add though that my friend Daniel said that he just picked up your Resurrection book, so that's pretty cool. Um,
Thanks, Daniel. And I will say, I told Kevin this too, that every time people say that they pick it up, I do. That was the first book I wrote, so there are some things in there just writing style wise, and there's a couple of, I think, typographical things that I feel like I have to apologize for. It was my first book. I could have done better, and I think every content creator out there, their first video, their first song, their first book, they feel like they've grown as an artist since then. So I don't think it's the strongest thing I've written. So I just preface that I've changed my mind on some things, but in general, I think for my first work, it's decent. But I always just put that out there just for transparency. So thanks for buying it, though.
yeah, yeah. Um, the only thing that I kind of wanted to highlight here was uh, your point about the mass hallucination. I think is really interesting. I have this kind of like something occurred to me somewhat recently is that a lot of the atheist skeptic types who want to explain away Fatima will point to mass like illusion, like mass delusion kind of. And the typical kind of Catholic apologist response is we don't know of any such phenomena where everybody has the same like hallucination at the same time. Mass hallucinations just aren't a thing that are known to occur in nature. To which my response is, like, I'm so sorry, Mr. Catholic apologist. Your best case scenario for Fatima is mass hallucination. Because we know that the sun didn't literally careen towards the earth.
Yeah, it's a divinely caused mass hallucination, if you want to posit that at
Sure.
best, if you're being charitable. But that's, again, that does seem a little ad hoc. And that's also not, I mean, people do use that for resurrection arguments too, like the appearance of the 500, right? Could have been something like Fatima. We don't know any of the details about it in that way. And I do believe in the resurrection as a Christian, but I don't think that particular instance is the strongest case you could have. And yes, I think if for the apologists who say that you can't ever have mass hallucinations, they're technically correct, but they're also misusing the term hallucination, where that's not really a term in the literature, but there are cases where groups of people at the same time think that they're seeing something, which could be like an illusion, you could say, with an external referent that isn't really there, or mass hysteria, right? And there's a good article by Jake O'Connell called Jesus' Resurrection and Collective Hallucinations, published in the Tyndale Bulletin, to look into. He gives a couple cases that's really interesting. But yeah, you have cases where people, my favorite one is in the late or early 19th century in Victorian England. You had this guy named, this spirit named Spring-Heeled Jack, who there was a newspaper report about him attacking a woman. He clawed her, he breathed fire, and then he leaped over, a building probably 10 feet in the air. And once this was reported in the newspaper, other people started seeing him, and he had plenty of reports of attacking. Oh, he got me. I saw him here. I saw him here. There's a carriage. I saw him jump over the roof, right? And they were they weren't consistent how he looked. Sometimes he was wearing a helmet, had claws and red eyes. Sometimes he looked like a gentleman. The descriptions were inconsistent. And so, but you have groups of people who think out of fear that they're seeing something and reporting it. Of I saw it too. You see this with Bigfoot sightings and other things like that. So it's one of those things. And yes, sometimes you do have them simultaneously. But again, it really just depends on the scenario. But you can have situations where you see that. What is it? Oh, actually, if you look, I can kind of see it. It's like you're pointing out, you sort of say that you see, even though you don't, but you can make it out if you like squint and you sort of see what they're talking about. It's kind of like that thing, right? So do some people play along? Do some people really think they see something? Do some people not see anything? That's typically how it is. I don't know of any case where, to my knowledge, where everyone has claimed to see it and they all see the exact same thing and they all see it. Usually it's some people see it, some people don't. The people who see it disagree with what they're seeing and stuff like that. So,
real quick, I just want to point out who's in the house. What's up, Jonathan and Braxton and team?
I was with Braxton down. He doesn't live super far from me. I went down with her a couple of weeks ago and was on his channel in person. So it was nice to get to meet him in person. He's taller than I thought he would be in person. So I'll give that to you, Braxton.
I might be taller than most people think I am too. I'm 6'2", 6'3" if I stand up really straight. So
yeah, I'm 5'10", almost 5'11". So that's 6'2" is.
Who's taller, me or Braxton?
I don't know. I think I don't know Braxton put in that. I think Braxton's probably like 6 foot, maybe.
I might have him. Okay, and I'm not super far from either. Well, I don't know how far I am from you, but I'm about 2.5 hours east of Braxton, I think. So I'm in Lexington, Kentucky. So I'm not like crazy far.
Okay, I'm originally from Louisville, actually. That's nice.
No way, I didn't know that.
I didn't realize that.
That's
Yeah, I didn't.
cool.
I just now figured that out. Yeah.
That's super cool. We were neighbors through time. Um, um,
Yeah.
I also just want to say that Absurd Scandal let us know that Jimmy Aiken has a good episode on Spring Heel Jack. So I haven't
Oh,
seen that, and I'm a big fan of
I
Mysterious
haven't either.
World.
That's funny. Brett, he has an episode almost everything. By
I
the way, there's
know.
actually I need to check with him on this. There was after we did our virgin birth debate, I emailed him a particular case that I thought was interesting for a show, and he wrote up a script. I still don't know when he's going to release it, if he is going to release it, but it's about a particular case called the Miracle of Klonda, which we might talk about here. But he's supposed to be doing an episode on it at some point, so keep a lookout for that. But I gave him basically the template for that, and he thought it was really interesting. So maybe we'll see Mysterious World episode on that sometime soon.
That'd be super cool. That'd be super cool. One other thing before I navigate on to the next topic is that my friend Pick and Choose said that he remembers being at a long Hispanic Protestant service. He doesn't speak Spanish, but at one point, people were falling down everywhere. Everyone was clustering and pointing at somebody's mouth. Somebody said that crosses were appearing on people's teeth, and Pick and Choose said that he pretended to see it, but he didn't actually see anything. But a bunch of people swore they saw. I do wonder if there's ever like a performative aspect and almost like a peer pressure aspect to like,
Yeah.
like if everybody else sees that they see it, like, did you not see it because you're not pious enough? Should you just pretend that,
Yeah.
I wonder,
You know, it's funny that you bring that up because, and I don't want to go on too many things, but I know there's a sort of a free form thing.
Yeah.
There are people who are former Pentecostals I've heard say that in terms of like when they were speaking in tongues, they knew that they were making something up just on the spot, but they did it because everyone else was doing it, and they, how slash like not or whatever it is. They'll just say something on the spot because they feel that kind of pressure to do it, and it's sort of a acquired thing, not for everyone. There are some people I know, some people who've also said that they've done it without ever even knowing what it was. So I can't speak for everyone, but I do know of some cases people have confessed to that. But in terms of the doing it out of pressure too, there's granted, this is a third-hand account, so I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but it's plausible. Joseph Smith with Mormonism. He had at one point, this comes from the governor of Illinois at the time, who said that at one point Joseph was in a room with some of the Mormons in the church, and he had the box, and he told them that the plates were in the box, and he opened it, and there was nothing in there. And they say, "Well, Brother Joseph, we don't see anything." And Joseph scolds them and says, "Repent, brethren, for your sinning, and the Lord has hidden your eyes from it." So they get on their knees and pray for a few hours, and then eventually when they look back, they're convinced they can see the plates in the box. So that kind of manipulation is something that you do have to be careful of. Hypnotists can do it, and certain religious people in those circumstances. So as I think you can see, I definitely try to be as careful as I can with this stuff. I do believe that miracles happen, but I don't hold that we should just accept every testimony because of issues like this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Fatima is probably one of the most popular, like, big miracles and big Marian apparitions. So the fact that you have your reservations about it, I think, is a testament to your commitment to a skepticism. And when I say I'm agnostic, when I say skepticism, I mean it in a good way. I don't mean it in like a a derogatory way. Okay, so that was Fatima. We might have one more apparition where we have mostly agreement before we move into an area where we might have some disagreement, and that would be Guadalupe. So just very briefly for my audience, in the early 16th century, the legend goes that Our Lady appeared to Saint Juan Diego, and she told him to go back to the bishop and tell him to build a church. Juan Diego says, the bishop won't believe me, so you have to give me a sign. So she makes flowers grow. He gathers the flowers and puts them in his tilma, which is his cloak. He carries them thinking that the flowers are the sign, but when he drops them in front of the bishop, it turns out that there is a miraculous image of Our Lady on the tilma. That tilma is preserved to this day, and many people attribute miraculous qualities to it. I've done a video, I think I've done 2 videos on the tilma. It shouldn't be surprising to anybody who knows me that I'm skeptical of the tilma. But Caleb, I guess, how familiar are you, I guess, with Guadalupe? And then do you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah, no, I'm generally familiar. I do think that you're right. I'm very skeptical of first of all, I think the story itself, as far as I know, historically is probably not that well verified. I think our earliest source to it's pretty late.
It's 100 years later.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any contemporaneous accounts of it. So it probably is a legend. And the tilma, I've not been very impressed with the qualities that have been associated. It ranges from like, oh, it's amazingly not rotted, even though it's on this kind of material, to something as strange as, I mean, there were reports, I think, where someone was like, oh, I put a stethoscope up and I could hear a heartbeat, or I looked in the eyes and you can see the reflection of the person, of the people looking, and it's just stuff like that. And when you like look at a lot of the details, they're very speculative in terms of, oh, this ink blotch looks kind of like this, or it's also been painted over, so it's hard to know what parts are originally there and what parts are painted over. So there's just a lot of issues that I have with that. And I'll just say for Marian apparitions in general, I think one contention that I have is that most of the time they're very inconsistent and culturally derivative. So when you look at something like Fatima or Medjugorje or something like that, when she appears to Catholics in Europe, typically she'll be a white woman, younger in that way. When she appeared in Guadalupe, she looked like a Latina woman with darker skin. When she appeared in, I think it was, I'm trying to remember where in Africa, there was a place in Southern Africa where she had appeared to, I think Coiho or something like that. She was African American. So her appearance is contingent on where she's appearing to. Now, some Catholics will say, well, she wants to appeal to her audience. And so she takes on different forms to relate to them better. You could say that, or you could also say that people see what's culturally derivative and they're projecting their own kind of image on it. If you had a really consistent view independently across different cultures, that'd actually be really impressive, right? But you see the same issue with like alien abduction stories. If you're abducted in the United States, they typically look like gray aliens, like the big bulbous head ones. If you do it from South America, they look more like hairy monsters. In Europe, they look a lot more humanoid. Some places they look more like reptiles. So you could say that. So we could hypothesize that either A, different species of aliens are abducting different ethnicities of people, or B, that a lot of this is culturally derived and projected. And I think the second one's probably generally more likely to be true.
I've been reading a book by Dr. Jim Madden. He's a Catholic philosopher, and he did a really interesting book on the UFO.
Oh, okay.
And it's really cool. This book, I'm not going to call it UFO apologetics because it's not. But what it is a it's admitting the extent of what human beings can actually say with certainty. So it's kind of like, hey, look, if there were beings that were just simply outside of what human beings can perceive, then we have no way of knowing this. And so maybe we should be a little bit more humble. That's kind of, I'm only halfway done, but I've been trying to read like a lot of UFO literature on top of this all at the same time. And I do think it's interesting how it seems like sometimes UFO abductions stop at country borders, which is like really interesting. Right. It's like, why would that happen?
It wasn't the first UFO abduction case, Bonnie and Betty, like in the 40s or so, which is right when this sort of thing was taking off in pop culture, and you had all the sci-fi craze of the 40s and 50s, right? You don't have on a wide scale these going back hundreds of years or something like that. They're relatively recent. And as you said, it's usually contingent on Western countries that have a predisposition to it. I do know of a couple exceptions, but generally you don't have these in like African and Asian countries, at least as much as you have it in like the United States, because they're less familiar with it. So that's the general rule, at least. I know there's a Zimbabwe one that's really interesting, but we could go on about that for a while, especially if Jimmy Akin's here. So yeah, yes. I think we agree on that particular point about Guadalupe, though, in terms of not being overly impressed with that.
Okay, how about Lourdes? Lourdes is different than the other two that we just spoke about, primarily because the main miracle of Lourdes is not the apparition itself per se. So the main miracle of Fatima is the miracle of the sun, which happened during the apparition. The main miracle of Guadalupe is the tilma, which happened during the apparition. The main miracle of Lourdes are the miraculous healings that occurred, I guess, during the apparitions, but then also extended until modern day, according to some. And so this is very different. So I wonder if you have a different opinion about Lourdes. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So in terms of the apparition itself, I think it's interesting, but it pretty much comes down to the testimony of one little younger girl named Bernette Moro, a 14-year-old who claimed that she kept seeing a woman appear to her, and she didn't recognize her at first. I think it was the second to last appearance is when the woman finally identified herself as the Immaculate Conception, or l'Immaculée Conception, or Je suis l'Immaculée Conception, I'm the Immaculate Conception, in that way. And that's when it was attributed to the Virgin Mary. But she would be, on her knees, basically in a visionary state, and people would be around her. There'd be big crowds, but they couldn't see anything besides what Bernette saw. And I do think Bernette was probably sincere, because she was persecuted for this. Police did not like the public gatherings. They did threaten to put her in jail, and they told her to stop this multiple times, and she kept doing it. Now, I will say that during these experiences, she did, although the apparition itself was not visible, there were things that happened that were. So at one account from eyewitnesses that we have, while she was in this dazed state looking at the Virgin Mary, she became basically transfigured. Her face lit up in the light, kind of like what you have in the Bible. And people saw this. There was another one where she was doing this holding a candle, and there was a doctor at the time who noticed her hand was on the fire, and it showed no signs, and she was just in the state. It was on there for several minutes to an hour at a time. And then after she was out of this state, as she was walking back, he took a little lighter and burnt her slightly, and she jumped back in pain, and was oh, that's so she could feel it then. So he figured she was in some kind of trance-like state. Now, there are people who can put themselves in those kind of state, who walk on fire and stuff like that. You've seen those, some Indian gurus who can do that. And there's also the point about her body allegedly being incorrupt. I'm sure you've seen that. I know you did a show on incorruptible bodies, which I didn't watch, but that one's well known too, in that way. But yes, you are right. The main miracles there are with the healing. So when Bernadette saw the Virgin told her to dig at a certain puddle, to dig underground. And when she did, there was a stream that popped up, and she started drinking from it. And allegedly this stream had miraculous power. So the first case that a woman healed, I believe she'd had a paralyzed hand for years, and she put her hand in there and was able to move it for the first time. So that kind of sparked this whole idea of the Medical Bureau investigating it. And the Bureau was found in the 1860s. This happened in the 1850s, but it evolved into the modern day version. I think in 1905 is when the Vatican officially sort of recognized it and gave it the standards they operate. And the most recent revision, I think, was in the 40s or 50s, when you have the International Medical Bureau Boards. So that's how it's gone. There have been 7,000 cases that have been looked at by the Bureau that have been deemed inexplicable, but there's only been 70 that have been officially certified as a miracle. And one thing that I would like to I think correct, that you and other people have said in terms of the Vatican approving it. The Vatican actually does not technically approve any of. The Vatican stays out of this mostly. It's the local bishops of the diocese who make that call. So there are plenty of. I think there is a misunderstanding when people think that the 70 are the only 70 that have ever been verified, and that's not true. There 70 are the ones where the Medical Bureau signed off on it, and then the bishop of the diocese, which the person who was healed is from, said, okay, we can certify this as a miracle. Okay. But there are plenty of cases where they do certify it and the bishop doesn't want to say it. And it's not always even clear why that is. But there's a good paper. You have one too, but another one I wanted to bring up, I actually found this relatively recently too. It's called Unexpected Healings in Lourdes Catholic Sanctuary, an epidemiological review on the cases canonically acknowledged, published in Clinical Case Reports and Reviews, I think in 2019. That's the year. Yeah, 2019. So that's a really good overview where he basically does a systematic review of all the cases, does charts, and shows you the correlations between time frame and stuff like that. And what's interesting is that people will point out that, you have more in the earlier years than you have in the later years, and that is it a coincidence as technology gets more advanced, you have less and less miracles, popping off. And in the article that you talked about in your video, which is a very good article by Francois, I forget his name, called the Lord's Medical et al. Yes, et al.
Francois et al.
The Lord's Medical Cures Revisited, and he does a systematic approach as well, does an excellent job on that. And he points that out. And yes, in the earlier years, you had medicine was still relatively new. You had not as accurate reporting and lots of issues with that. And so a lot of people put off by that. And I think that is certainly a good point. And I'm not here to say that all 70 of those miracles are legitimate. There are ones that they affirmed that I don't think they should have, and there are ones that they didn't affirm that I think they should have. So not that the Bureau affirmed it and it just never got declared. So again, it's not necessarily a correlation of the quality of the evidence is what bases it off of the confirmation. In fact, in that article that I cited, there are they actually do a review where they see the correlation. For example, you see a drop off cases around World War II,
Mm-hmm.
obviously because not many people were traveling and because they were prioritizing a lot of other things during World War II. It also correlates with popes. Some popes were very much like, "Oh yeah, please go ahead, bishops, and do what you want." Some of them were very much like, we don't really need to like hold off on this or not the whole miracle stuff. And so there's a lot of political and social reasons for why one would be declared and stuff like that too. So there's a lot of controlling factors you have to look at. And it's not purely a review of just as time goes on, you get less reports. In fact, when you look at cases for the lowest period, I think, in terms of numbers reported was from the 70s to the 90s. There's actually been an uptick in the last 30 years or so in terms of being confirmed and being approved. So, like, it's not a significant drop off, right, in that way. So, it does depend on that. Now, as I said, there are some cases that I think the older ones that I wouldn't be as confident in, especially if it deals with neurological symptoms like paralysis, because a lot of the time we diagnose those now with spinal taps or with like an MRI, which wasn't really around in the 60s and 70s. So some of the ones that deal with neurology are probably going to be misdiagnoses or could be hysterical in that way. But there are other cases that are even some of the older ones that I think are interesting because I think it's close to probably a quarter or at least a fifth of all the cases were tuberculosis, some kind of tuberculosis, because that was very common the early 1900s, late 1800s, as I'm sure you know. And tuberculosis, depending on how much it metastasizes, is a very visual disease. I mean, typically it starts off as pulmonary, the lungs, and it can cause you to spit up blood, but it can also spread to other parts of the body, to the legs, the face, the hands. And so those cases, although a lot of them from like the 1890s, which is like the golden age of Lourdes, a lot of those are such a case that I don't think you could realistically say that like a misdiagnosis is like a probable explanation because you'll have some cases like one of Marie Lemarchand, who was had tuberculosis. She was coughing up in the lungs, and she's described by one doctor as her face is literally eaten away. She has no cartilage in her nose. Her lips are like that. She had to wear a veil because how scarred her face was, right? And pus coming all out of this, very disgusting. Looks more like a monster than a woman, as one person said. Wouldn't be very politically correct today, but it's how they described it. And so she goes to Lourdes, comes out of the water, and the bandages fall off, and all of her face is covered in pink skin again, lightly. And her doctors confirm this. So stuff like that that's very visual, things that are swollen that go away fast, or open wounds with pus that close instantaneously. Those kinds of things, although in some of the older reports, I don't think you could realistically say are just misdiagnoses because, like, again, you don't need to have specialization technology to see a giant gaping wound with pus close before your eyes. That's something that virtually any layman could do, including doctors who don't have X-ray technology or something like that. So it just depends on the case, and I think it needs to be a case by case basis. But there are some legitimately interesting ones that I think are very difficult to explain, and that's why I don't just write them all off. So I think doing a case approach is generally more efficient in that way.
Can I ask you a question specifically about the Francois et al. Paper? Because
Yeah.
I found something like that I didn't understand when I was like writing the script to my video, and you might have the answer where I didn't. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and pull up the paper, just to kind of illustrate my point.
Yeah. 18 was the most recent one. 2018. I think 2019. Oh, 2014. Wait. Oh, it says 2014 is the published online. I guess it was published online before it was published in the journal, but yeah. 2005. Yeah, there was a 2005, and there's one in the late 90s as well. So I'm not sure if that's if they're referencing the like approved ones or if they maybe they mean like the list that's not out. I don't. I again, I'd have to see the context of that because that is very strange, but that would not technically be accurate in terms of that. Yes. Yes. That would be weird. It makes sense for them to be part of the 1200, but not the 70. But I wouldn't know why they would distinguish between, unless the way they're doing the sample. I'd have to reread that paper. But that is a really good, interesting point. Now, I will say that it also gets confusing because the time frame in which it's approved does not mean that it occurred there. So I wonder if they're saying that no miracle has, which again, this wouldn't be accurate, but maybe by the time they publish this, because like the one that was published in 2000, sorry, was approved in 2005 that you mentioned, the miracle actually happened, I think, in the 50s or the 60s, but they took years to look over because the long that's another thing too you see in terms of why there's less of them approved because now they're waiting longer because in the past they would wait maybe 5 or 6 years. Now it's like a few decades in terms of they really want to wait it out to make sure there's no relapses. There is one of the 70 cases I know. I think it's number 60 actually, if I'm not mistaken. That it actually had it was the only case I know of where one of the people they were healed, it was canonized, approved, and then 17 years after the healing, it relapsed and they actually died. So that's an unfortunate one that happened after they had approved it. But granted, 17 years is a pretty long time to be in remission. But that's I think why they're very hesitant about approving things, why they really want to wait in that way. But it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, if you have a case that's from decades ago, there's always the question of okay, but does modern technology or is it better? Do we want to trust data from decades ago? But on the other hand, if it's something that happened recently, like a few years ago, then the question is, well, how long do we need to wait? Because what if they relapse? So it's a heads I win, tails you lose. If it's too long ago, oh, sorry about your luck. If it's too recent, well, we don't know how long we have to wait to say it's really permanent. So that's where it gets a little tricky sometimes to do that. But yeah, and if we're going to talk about just the like again, like we could spend the whole show on just Lourdes, but the most recent one, just for the sake of recency, Bernadette Suber. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, it's Bernadette Moro. She was actually named after the Bernadette of Lourdes originally. So Bernadette Moro was a nun, and she first had back problems in the 1960s from what was diagnosed as cauda equina, which sort of narrows the spinal column, caused nervous problems. And this progressively got worse over the years. So in the 60s, she was suffering from back pain. In the 70s, 80s, she had 4 different surgeries, which didn't correct it. So by the time we get to about the 90s, she's in a full corset, has to wear a neck collar. She has to be in a catheter. She can walk, but she has to wear a boot and like crutches sometimes. And she's on full morphine every day, the dependency of the pain coming to the 2000s, she's has almost no mobility whatsoever, and like again, multiple surgeries didn't correct this. So she, I think, in her 70s, goes to Lourdes in 2008, and while she's there, nothing initially happens. But when she comes back to the sanctuary, I think 2 or 3 days after her trip, she hears a voice that tells her like get up and walk, and so she, after a few seconds of hesitancy, gets up, takes her boot off, starts walking without any pain, takes her catheter out, and I think the day after that, she walked like 5 miles or something with her sister, or something like that. And this was an instantaneous cure, complete. Her foot that had been twisted was corrected. Another thing that was pretty incredible is that she also had no morphine withdrawal. She'd been on morphine for decades at that point, dependency, and she just quit it that day without any kind of withdrawal, no pain. And that was in 2008. The Lourdes Medical Bureau looked at this for 10 years and they certified in 2018 when they had looked at it. And they had put her through. There's actually a recent ABC, no, I think it was 2020 documentary where they go to Lourdes and interview the chief consultant there at the medical bureau. And he talks about how like they put her through all these things and they ask, oh, so this is something that could be peer reviewed. And he says, no, it's not, it not could be, it is. He says, I can say with absolute confidence that Sister Bernadette saw no less than 300 physicians. That's including rheumatologists, neurologists, all these different things. We did, x-rays, and we sent her back to this one to make sure. She saw psychologists to make sure she wasn't hysteric and hallucinating things. We put her through all this stuff. And he says, I assure you that if any doctor comes here and would like to look at a record, I'm more than happy to share it. And I believe this case was published in the International Journal of Medical Case Reports or something like that a few years ago. So pretty interesting case in that one. So the reason why something like that sticks out for me is because, you can always say, oh, we just don't know, we can't conclude a miracle. And that's fair, but I do think when it comes to, and we might get into this in terms of how to determine a miracle, I think the more elements you have, the more difficult that's going to be. Because if you have a miracle that's not only instantaneous, but complete, and it covers a bunch of different areas. So someone could have gotten better from back pain, but still be on morphine or still be a catheterized, right? But for someone to be healed of not only the back, but also the paralysis of the bladder, and also the morphine withdrawal, and also the foot drop, all at the same time, seems very, very hard to explain. If you're just going to say you're going to deposit like multiple independent different mechanisms in the body to do that at the same time, which seems kind of ad hoc and doesn't really make sense. Usually you have gradual recoveries where you get better piece by piece if it's a serious disease, especially one that's only gotten worse over years. Because the criteria that they're typically looking at, and this is the criteria that I use as well when I'm looking at a miracle healing, called the Lambertini criteria, was developed in the 1700s by who would later become Pope Benedict XIV. And that's, you want a disease, first of all, it needs to be medically documented, but the main conditions are that it is an organic disease. So nothing that's psychosomatic. We're not talking about placebos. We need to verify that, like with an x-ray or with something, there's something actually in the body that's causing this, because people can think that they're sick when they're not, right? You want an organic disease. You want a disease that's progressive. So it's something that's not getting better. You weren't getting better before you were healed. It was either stabilized or more likely it was getting worse. So in Bernette Moro's case, it had been getting worse. She started with back pain, which progressed until she was eventually basically in a wheelchair, and it got progressively worse, and certain treatments were not able to fix it largely. And these being instantaneous healing, so not something that took days or weeks, usually something preferably within a few seconds, a few minutes, no more than an hour, basically, which again would be extraordinary for something that's a progressive disease that had otherwise not gone into remission in that way. It needs to be complete. So they didn't just get better and improve, but complete being that they're on no more treatments, no more medications, no more crutches or wheelchairs or whatever. They have full mobility. Now, that does get a little bit tricky because people from Lourdes do come back with what they call souvenirs, where they will have like one little piece of their disease left, but it won't be hurting them. So you might have someone who was like in a wheelchair for decades who has like a slight limp now, but he can walk, right? Or someone where they might be healed of a cut, but they have the scar going down. That the scar doesn't go away, but they have everything else. Where it's some sign to show that there was originally something there, but it doesn't debilitate them anyway. It's just aesthetically there. It's benign. So that's what complete would be. You also want a permanent cure, so nothing that's going to relapse, and that's why you have to wait so long now to make sure something doesn't come back. And you want it to be a spontaneous cure, so something that wasn't attributable to medicine. And typically, it's even more compelling if they'd had plenty of treatments before and it clearly didn't work. Like I said, failed surgeries where treatments on all grades did not work and only made it worse. Treatments that are allowed, you can have palliative treatments that aren't meant to be better, but just meant to stabilize you. But if you were taking something that could have contributed to your well-being, that gets thrown out. And that's another reason why it's harder to look at these things when we're in the modern age, because yeah, it's true that you're going to have less misdiagnosis and less medical mysteries, let's say, the more we learn about science in that way. But at the same time, when you have a criteria about being spontaneous, more people now than ever have access to healthcare, thank God, especially in Europe where it's universal in most countries. And so it's really hard now to even count most cases because virtually everyone who goes to Lourdes now who's in a serious condition has some access to medicine or treatment in a particular way. And it's hard to rule out that what they were on didn't contribute in some way to their getting better. So that's another factor. But yeah, if you have all those criteria there, that's what makes this different than normal spontaneous remissions, which do happen and stuff like that. Because yes, diseases can go away from time to time, depending on what it is, but you don't have spontaneous remissions of something that was otherwise extremely progressive happening instantaneously, completely, permanently. Usually they have relapses in that kind of way. And if you have that article there, one thing I wanted just to read off that they say, because they're pretty critical of a lot of the Lourdes cures. And you can tell, I think it's a very fair article, but if you go to where the conclusion is, it's the paragraph before that. So scroll down a little bit more. I think that's where it is. Conclusions. Okay, go up a little bit to that preceding paragraph. Yeah. Let me see. Here we go. The Lourdes phenomenon that led to physical cures has been extremely powerful. Spontaneous remissions of diseases, especially of cancer, do not measure up to the speed, power, and variety of the Lourdes cures. Yet Lourdes has its critics aplenty from medical leaders, and then he goes on. We surmise that also the autosuggestion placebo effect played a role in a number of the improvements and allegations of cures. It's also likely that hysterical played a factor. Situations, but we were told by the Bureau of Physicians Practice since 1970 that they were wary of hysteria and prepared to deal with these situations. So they say that autosuggestion could play a role into this, but they also say that Lourdes does have examples of remissions that aren't really analogous to anything that you see in the secular world, right? If something goes away, it goes away a lot faster and a lot completer than it does in secular context. So that's how it is. And they say that, I think, in the conclusion too, that there are some that are genuinely inexplicable, even though some of them might not be. So yeah, but that's basically what I had to say on that. I know that was a lot, but
No, I think that was all good. Turns out that my audio wasn't working while we're on the other screen, so I'm just not going to talk if we're on the other screen, but that's fine. Mostly we'll just hang out here anyway. But yeah, I wound up having a lot of thoughts during that whole thing, but I think that most of those thoughts are going to wind up kind of coming back during the epistemology section of our discussion. So the only question that I want to ask you right now, I think, is would you expect a roughly constant rate of miracles, allowing exceptions for things like World War II, if we were able to filter out all of the kind of false positives from the first half of the 20th century due to just medicine not being very advanced? Or do you think that it's like there's no reason why we should expect like a steady rate of miracles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure because, as I said, I think the fact that you see I think the fact that medicines become more prevalent has mean miracles are less relevant. Not completely. I'm not saying that people don't still suffer, but I think there's a reason why most of the miracles you hear from come from the third world. And yes, skeptics will have a reason to say, well, it's because it's less documented and less hard to verify. And that might be true. But at the same time, if 80% of people who have visual impairments live in developing countries, I'm going to expect that if there's a God who's healing people, it's probably going to be more that they're going to get the brunt of it more than people who have ways to aid that, or at least to mitigate their pain. So yeah, I'm not sure I would expect there to be necessarily the same amount now as there was then, because we have cures now for tuberculosis. So there's medicines you can take to cure that. So it would be kind of unnecessary, which is why typically when people go to there, you see cures of things that either don't go away naturally, or if they do, it's very, it's nothing that's like completely curable. Usually it's something that might be able to be mitigated or made less bad, but they're still typically chronic diseases that at best you can just make the person suffer less, like putting them on morphine or something like that. But they're typically not things that are easily fixable in that particular way. So
Okay.
I think those kinds of diseases, that'll stay the same rate. But for a lot of the conditions that are better, I mean, when's the last time you've had someone healed of polio? Well, I don't think anyone's had polio since 1950. I mean, I know that's not
Something
true,
like
but,
that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I do think that certainly plays a role.
One last question for you about Lourdes before we can move on to kind of non-Marian apparition miracles, and that would just be listening. So if I was a listener and I just tuned in to maybe the last 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, cool, Caleb's Catholic. Wait a minute. Caleb might not be. What does a non-Catholic Christian make of just the idea? So let's grant, for the sake of this part of the conversation, that the Lord's healings, at least a decent percentage of them, are indeed authentic. What does a non-Catholic Christian who maybe comes from a tradition that doesn't elevate the Blessed Virgin Mary to the same extent that Catholics do, what does that kind of person make of the fact that these miracles are indeed authentic,
That's a great question. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is, if I were to guess, I would probably say that because you see this phenomenon also in Protestant circles, granted, it's not as well documented because the Catholic Church has had a little bit of a leg up in terms of the organization of looking to these things, which is why I have such a large section on them in volume 2, because they just objectively have better documentation of this stuff, and good for them. When you have that higher tier, since the Council of Trent, they haven't even been allowed to, they have to get these approved before they can just sign off on them. So that's one reason why they're better documented. But in terms of them being prevalent, again, I do see these happening in Pentecostal circles as well, in Protestant circles. And I think that I'm very much open to sort of Christian inclusivism, where although I'm not Catholic, I think Catholics are brothers and sisters in Christ. And I have a lot of respect for them. So I think that God is rewarding people based on faith, and people who are willing to travel sometimes thousands of miles and spend a lot of money to go somewhere for even a very small chance of being healed, I think is very noble. And sometimes God rewards people for their faith like that, regardless of the particular aspects of their denomination being correct in that way. Like, I don't think someone's sinning by having high reverence for Mary. I might disagree with it theologically, but I don't think that it's idolatrous in the way that a lot of Protestants do.
So you're telling me that God doesn't get very mad when you compliment his mother?
I don't think he does. No,
Okay.
I think that
All right.
I think he appreciates people being faithful regardless of that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Sorry, I just had to put on my Catholic hat for a second. I know I just said that we're going to be like one last question before we move on. I forgot I had a bonus question about Marian apparitions.
Yeah.
This one doesn't have to do with Lords, at least, though, and we can make this one quick. So I linked to your appearance on Capturing Christianity from like a year ago when you did the Big Miracles stream, in the description down below. In that stream, you only talk about, well, you only have slides at least for one Marian apparition. Zaytun, not a Catholic Marian apparition. I'm interested to hear if you think that Zaytun is the best attested Marian apparition, like better than Lourdes and better than Fatima and all that. Yeah, do you think Zaytun is the best? That's the question.
Yeah, I do. Not, I mean, the healings are not better attested than Lourdes are, but just the apparition itself, I think it's hands down, I would say. It's also one of the only ones you have like photographs of. Anyone who watches that stream will know. Some of them are gimmicked or at least enhanced. So if you Google image it, not all of them are reliable, but there are some that are genuinely there. And for just to give the footnotes version, you can just look at that video for the full one. Zaytun is a region of Cairo where Coptic Orthodox Christians traditionally believe Mary passed through when going to Egypt when they were fleeing from Herod and Matthew. And in the 1920s, there was a man who was going to build a hotel on that spot, and he ended up building a church because the Virgin Mary appeared to him in a dream and told him there was going to be a miracle there someday. So fast forward to 40 years, we're in the late 1960s, 1967, and people start seeing, well, they think it's a woman at first, but they start seeing this apparition figure on top of this of St. Mary's Church, right? And it disappears. And if that had been the one time, it's like, okay, people see weird things. We talked about Fatima. But the weird thing is this kept happening at the same building on the same thing over the course of 3 years, sometimes a couple times a week, sometimes once or twice a month, and directly. And this, if you look at a lot of the photographs, sometimes it looks kind of bulbous and just like a ball of light, but other times it looks very humanoid. There's even photos of what's allegedly looks like her sitting down and holding the baby Jesus while surrounded by incense. There are some that look like there are doves around her and that she's praying. So it's this very weird thing. And I think it'd be great if you did an episode on it sometime. I'd be curious how you see. But I have yet, and this was seen by, with no exaggeration, probably close to 1 million people, at least hundreds of thousands. But it got so much to where they actually had to tear down buildings because of how many people were flooding in. Because Zaytun's a relatively small neighborhood. It's not like a huge, it wasn't that significant before this happened. But you had hundreds of thousands of people, bigger than most like football stadiums, filling into this relatively small neighborhood around this single building to see this thing. And they did a whole investigation. They couldn't find any kind of projections when they tore the other buildings around it down, because they were thinking there might be some kind of projection there. There was nothing there. And so no one to this day has really been able to figure out what the origin of this light was. The closest one you've been able to see was a paper published in the 80s about earthquake lights, which are a phenomenon that's hypothesized where due to friction or something like that, it causes electromagnetism that creates a light. But the problem is, for that paper that they've been criticized on, they were talking about earthquakes that were happening 400 kilometers away. And even if you think that they look like Marian apparitions, they don't. If you look at the image of a earthquake light, it covers a much bigger area. It's not designated to a specific little like building, like where you could point to that. And of course, it wouldn't be in the same building for 3 years in the same spot, or at least sometimes it's in the courtyard, sometimes on the roof. But you're not going to have that in the same location for you're in Lexington. You're in Lexington, right? That would be Lexington to Chicago. I don't know how many. That's at least a couple hundred miles. That's like saying an earthquake or something. Yeah, it's like if you had like an earthquake in Lexington, and on the Sears Tower, there was a light, and I was to posit that saying, yes, because there were earthquakes in Lexington, it caused all of these lights that were only on the Sears Tower and around it, into all directions. It seems very implausible. And the people who wrote that article weren't even geologists either, but so they got a lot of flack for that. So I have to just say, if that's the best explanation that anyone's come up with, then oh gosh, it seems pretty bad. So I don't know what to think of it, but I think if you were going to have a candidate there, this is, without too much hyperbole, I think the best attested in terms of like numbers of witnesses, probably the best attested miracle in modern history, maybe history itself, in terms of how many reports and firsthand accounts we have of it. So it's undeniable that something happened, but what that is a question for people to debate.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add here is so almost as many people who've asked me to have you on the show have also asked me to look at Zaytoon.
Yeah.
And my attitude, at least through until current day, has been there are so many Catholic miracles, and this is kind of like a Catholic channel. And you'd be surprised how many Catholics are like, yeah, like look up the Catholic Marian apparition of Zaytoon. And I'm like, oh, honey, no, Zaytoon is not a Catholic apparition. I am so sorry.
It was never approved by I mean, the Vatican didn't like disown it, but it was never officially like certified because of the context, right? So yeah, maybe that's why they don't count it, but I think it's better tested than a Catholic Marian apparition. I'm sorry for you trad cows out there, but I think the trumps of like almost everything in terms of attestation. So I can see why, but I guess it's like not incompatible with Catholicism, right? It's like, well, maybe Mary just maybe she was helping out her Orthodox brothers, but she still likes us, right? So maybe that's what it is. I don't know, but.
Yeah, and I mean, hey, like the trad Catholics are probably more similar to their Orthodox cousins than they are to their Novus Ordo Catholic brothers, where Novus Ordo is just the regular Catholics, not the trad Catholics.
Right. But I'm sure there's some out there who think it's a demon or something, but I don't think it takes this very seriously.
Yeah, I don't either. I'll save that part for the epistemology section, but I get frustrated with the every miracle I don't like is demons approach. But
yeah, as do I, but we can talk about it then. Yeah.
Cool. I wouldn't mind talking some non-Marian apparitions with you. I know that a couple of these topics are going to be covered in volume 2 of your forthcoming book. But in your appearance on Capturing Christianity, not the miracle one, the one from October, with the Halloween episode, you were talking a little bit about floating saints, levitating saints.
Yes.
And I grew up hearing these stories. So, I grew up trad cat, and the way that trads grow up is like you sit around in a circle and you listen to saint stories. That's just like part of growing up.
Like campfire stories, but with saints.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I would hear about stories of saints levitating like all the time. And full disclosure, levitating saints is not something that I've really like dug into with the same kind of like academic level of, I try to do a good amount of research before I publish most of my videos. I haven't really done any real research on levitating saints, but I will give you my unacademic intuition on what I would expect to find, and then I'll be curious to hear your response to kind of like me sharing what I expect to find. So, as with a lot of like hagiographies, I would expect a lot of these stories to be non-contemporaneous. So I wouldn't be surprised to find that stories of levitating saints didn't show up until 100 years after the saint died. I wouldn't be surprised to see certain stories kind of growing over time where like we do have contemporaneous sources where they just kind of outline like a pretty normal life, sure, a pious life, but a normal life. And then over time, we see these stories getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Wouldn't be surprised about stuff like that. With the exception of a saint like Padre Pio, I would expect most of these stories to come from the 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, stuff like that. And I would also expect there not to be a whole lot of literature about them in the first place, because I feel like hagiographies are just not super well covered. Those are kind of all of my no research done intuitions, half of which are probably wrong. Hopefully it's only half. I'm interested to hear what your take on levitating saints is. Are there any that look really promising? And if so, what do we make of that?
Yeah, so I think your first point is yes, for most of the cases, that is true. A lot of them are relatively late. I think there was one of Francis of Assisi levitating, and that's, I think that's a relatively late account. So that certainly is an issue with a lot of them. There are two in particular that I think are the best attested. Well, there's one who's easily the best attested, and there's a second one that's moderately well. The second one I'll start with first is I think it's Teresa de Avila, a Spanish saint, 17th century. Um, Plenty of accounts. She's also the only one. Well, not I don't know if she's the only one. She's the only big one that wrote firsthand about the experiences, where she would describe it. She almost described it as a choking sensation and being taken up in an ecstasy, and how it felt. But there were witnesses who saw her, sometimes as much as 4 or 5 feet in the air, being up there. I think there was one where she floated up to a tree, and that there was one where she was taking communion and just shot up and in front of everyone, like up to a window, and it startled a lot of people. I think the most well known was when she was with Saint John of the Cross. I forget his full name. And they were both sitting down contemplating the Trinity, and they both shot up in the air while in their chairs. And someone walked in and saw it, and was startled. And most of the paintings that you'll see this have a witness, because they usually have to have like who that account was, right? So that's one of the ones. I think easily the most well-known one, though, and the best attested, would be Joseph of Cupertino, also 1600s, Italian saint. And he's sort of known as that. He's actually the patron saint of pilots and astronauts because of that. I'm not even kidding. So it's really funny how that works out. And the best resource, if you want to look at this academically, and I know Cameron Bertuzzi planning on doing something on this relatively soon. Book just came out late last year called They Flew by Carlos Ayer, Yale University Press, A History of the Impossible. And he has a whole chapter on Teresa de Avila and of Joseph Cupertino. He basically just goes over all the sources. Again, Yale historian. So he talked about how the book's like he's been writing for the last 40 years and was not sure if he should put it out because of the reactions he would get. But he doesn't take a deliberate side in terms of, people definitely levitated. But he has a good quote where he says, look, as a historian, I can't say whether or not people actually levitated, but I do have to explain why so many people really thought that they did, right? So with Joseph, Joseph was raised, and he always wanted to be a priest, but he was also really bad at everything. Like he was the definition of a klutz. He got denied twice for being a priest because he was constantly messing everything up. But by grace of luck, he got it. And after he was ordained, I guess at the term, is when he first started levitating, about his mid-20s. And I think the first time was during a procession. He shot up in the air like a couple dozen feet and was in there for about 30 minutes until in a dazed state, until he eventually came down. And so Joseph would do this relatively frequently. And this is not just like some cases where someone is in the air for a few seconds, or where they're like a few inches off the ground. And you've seen magicians do that, right? Where they put their feet together and they go up for like 2 seconds. People are like, oh my gosh. Because that's what I would also have suspected too. It's like, okay, well, did people think that? And there are some cases where you could maybe make that case where he's a few inches, but the diversity of these is so impressive to where it becomes really hard to mitigate that. There are some cases where he's a few inches off the ground. There are some cases where he shoots up, and it's like I think there was one where there was like a statue of the Virgin Mary that's about 90 feet in the air that he flies up and grabs on and hugs, basically, and does that. There are cases where he flies backwards. There are cases where he would fly upside down. There are cases where he would be floating and people would try to grab him, but they would be taken up with him, and it would do that and stuff like that. There are ones where he would be holding things, or he'd be in the air, 20 feet in the air in a dazed state. Every time he did this, he was never usually like active, like playing. He was always in a dazed state where he would look like he was having a vision, and was not responsive, right? Usually his confessors would like tell him like, Joseph, get down, wake up, all that stuff. And normally he wouldn't hear them. And after a while, people even like started messing with him. Like he might be like a foot off the ground, let's say, in a dazed state, and people would prick him. They would like burn him with flames. They would even blow on him to see him like go a few ways because he was Liza Bloom. Really crazy stuff. And he would never react. So you have these really crazy stories, and most of them are contemporaneous. When he died, it was, I think, a few years after his death. You have the first diaries come out, and they give names of witnesses and stuff like that. So you have, I think, over 150, if I'm not mistaken, contemporaneous accounts of witnesses doing this. I think it's between 4 different biographies of that way using it, and so it's really interesting. But again, and this was not just, some of these weren't in front of devout Catholics. A lot of these happened in front of European politicians, like the Duke of Germany or something like that, where they would come. There was one particular one where they came, I think, from Spain, and Joseph saw them, and And he would always, like, not always, but he also would yell frequently, and you can imagine this terrified people. He would scream and like float up, and he floated over the heads of these people and landed there. And I think one of the wives of the men fainted and was so scared by this. And the funny thing is that he did this in front of the Pope, by the way, too. I don't know if I mentioned that. I forget. Pope Urban, maybe, I forget. He was taking communion, and he went to kiss the Pope's feet, and he shot up in the air, probably 20 feet in the air. And the Pope stares at this, and he says, if that man dies before I do, I will testify at his canonization to him being a saint, basically. But the church did not like this. They did not tout this in their apologetics. They actually told Joseph to stop, and Joseph's response was, I can't. I've asked God, and he won't let me. And so this was very much like against his will. So he was put in front of the Inquisition for, I think, a year or two, and they questioned him on his doctrine, stuff like that. Because levitation back in that time was also associated with the demonic. So people were levitating, you could be a witch, right? So they questioned him, and they said, okay, it seems like he's theologically sound. There's nothing super suspicious here, but you got to stop doing that. And again, he couldn't control it, right? So they disliked this because during Mass, people would be distracted. And you can imagine why this would get distracting very easily. He would be breaking the Mass, saying it, and he would just start being in the air, and he would be there 30 minutes to an hour just in that state. And then he would wake up and then finish the prayer and then go back down in this way. And he was sort of one of the first martyrs of fame because people, as you can imagine, constantly wanted to see this. And they had to move him to different little monasteries throughout his life. And people would always find him, but there would be times where they would come and break open the roofs just to see like inside. It's like actually crazy of how much these people tried to track him down and do this. And even do you know who Gottfried Leibniz is, the famous mathematician and theologian?
Yes.
Leibniz's arguments, yeah. Leibniz, and he was, I think, a Lutheran, if I'm not mistaken. Leibniz is a mentor, the Duke of somewhere in Germany, was visiting Cupertino at the time, and he met Joseph, and he saw Joseph doing the Mass, and Joseph couldn't break it because he's like, oh, there's an unbeliever here. And he levitates backwards in front of this mentor. And a day after that, when they talk, he eventually converts to Catholicism. Now, Leibniz mentions that Leibniz, when he writes about it, is very brief. He says, oh, yeah, my mentor so-and-so went to Cupertino where he met Joseph and converted to Catholicism. He doesn't say the reason why, but it is interesting that you have that account. So you have Protestants who attested this as well. So it was pretty much indisputed that this was a thing that went on, and people were scared by it, startled, didn't like it, told him to stop. And he did this throughout his whole life. So he died, I think, when he was 60 years old. He was in very poor health. He would fast like 4 or 5 times a week and eat very small things, rail thin, smelled terrible, constantly had to go to the doctor and get wounds spurred because of how much infections he got. But he always did this even to his old age. So the only realistic account that I've been able to find in terms of like a skeptical explanation was an article published by Joe Nickell a few years ago. And Joe Nickell tries to hypothesize that Joseph was basically a really talented acrobat and that he would be able to jump in the air and in these feats, and that these got exaggerated over time. And that's what people turn these stories to. Unfortunately, he has to cherry pick the accounts because even though he's dealing with contemporaneous accounts, he says, well, in some cases he jumps and then grabs onto something. And maybe some of these accounts that just wasn't mentioned, where it talks about him free floating in the air. Maybe he was grabbing onto something and just didn't mention that. But again, there's such a diverse thing about floating upside down, floating backwards, floating 90 feet in the air, floating 20 minutes. There's only so many ways one could be wrong about it. I can understand if someone mistakenly sees someone jump up for 2 seconds and misremembers the height, but it's really hard to misremember saying, oh yeah, someone was 15 feet in the air unaided for 30 minutes, me just watching them, in that way, especially on so many different repeated times. It was not just one instance, but hundreds of times. And not to mention Joseph's age, by the way. If you're going to say he was doing this in his 20s, maybe, but the fact that you're saying a 50-year-old man was able to do still doing all these feats in that poor of health seems just to stretch credulity at that point. So I don't really know what to think of it, but it's a super interesting case. I would highly recommend that book because it's really, really interesting to look at that.
Would you put the book up on the screen one more time? Because I'm going to pick up a copy, I think, myself. It's called, and it looks backwards to me, but it doesn't on the camera. I know it says They Flew.
Oh,
They Flew.
They Flew, A History of the Impossible.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
By Carlos Ayer.
Cool.
Yale historian.
And it doesn't look backwards on YouTube. It only looks backwards to me, which is annoying, but They Flew. Cool. I just want to add too that while we were talking, so my friend Daniel is Catholic, and he says that no, and Daniel's not kidding. He says he levitates sometimes. And I asked if it's like a physical or a spiritual or both, and he said, yeah, it's a combination. And then he did add, I should put levitate in quotes. But I think that this is a very interesting phenomenon. Daniel, I would love to hear more. And I also think I'm going to pick up a copy of They Flew because that sounds really interesting. And I can already imagine.
Make for a good episode, yeah.
Yeah, and I can already imagine a script forming in my brain because I think that that's like something worth looking into. Oh, and also Joe Nickel is a graduate of the University of Kentucky in Lexington.
Right. So, yeah, I would recommend reading his article too if you want to balance in terms of his criticisms of it. I've written it. I think I shared this with you. I wrote a blog post on I'll talk about this in the book whenever it comes out. But that's not going to be for another year or so. So if you want to wet your palate a little bit, I did write a fairly lengthy blog article on Joseph Cupertino on thinkchristiantheism.com. If you look at it, it was responding to this flying man thought experiment that the atheist Pine Creek gives.
Yes.
But then I go into like the actual flying man. So if you want some of the references there, just check that out. And I'm actually the only one that I know of who's like dealt pretty extensively with Nickel's article and critiquing it that I know. I don't think Ayer mentions it, or at least in a detail from what I can remember. So I would recommend looking at that. One other thing I'll just say, this is, I should have taught this earlier, but I think it's interesting, is that when you have this sort of undesigned parallel that I think is interesting, that seems almost independent, because you have a mention where Joseph, when he was doing these things, because what would your inclination be? You think if someone was levitating that their clothes would be hanging from them or they'd be upside down, but there's always descriptions where it was really tight, right? Like something was holding it in this way. Even when he was upside down, it would not like fall over his face, like the robes that they have. What's interesting is when you read accounts about levitations in demonic cases, sometimes you have that very similar description. Jerome mentions a case where women in Jerusalem were being exorcised, were floating upside down, and he says the dresses did not fall forward. It was almost like the clothing was also anti-gravity. And it's interesting that you see that mentioned with Joseph as well. From what I can tell, like independent of that, or at least not explicitly referencing that. So why there's a shared detail there, I don't know. I think that seems really interesting, though.
Now, Jerome is a 5th century saint, right? Jerome is
4th or 5th, I think, yeah.
So we're talking about like 1,000 years between Jerome and St. Joseph Cupertino.
Yeah, I'm sure that the Catholic authors were familiar with Jerome's work, but like it's not like it's a very well-known passage, or it's not referenced from any of the material I've seen. So it's sort of a niche thing, but I just like, oh, that's interesting. Noticing that. So,
cool. I think that should be pretty good on levitating saints. The next topic that I had for you, and I'm going to ask you a question. So I wanted to talk about other miracle healings besides Lourdes, and then after that I wanted to talk resurrections. If you feel like we've kind of talked enough about miracle healings, I'm fine to go right to resurrection. But I'm, dealer's choice. What are you thinking?
Doesn't matter to me. Do you want like non-Catholic ones, or do you just have a preference? Or I mean, we can stick with Catholic ones. That's fine. I just didn't know if, like, besides Lourdes miracle healings, or
I guess let me ask you at least this question.
Yeah.
So I'll ask a few questions in a row. Do you think that non-Catholic Christian miracle healings, at least some of them, are as well evidenced as the Catholic ones? If so, do you think that kind of challenges a very strict Catholic extra ecclesiam nulla salus kind of thing? And like, would it be the case that like some kind of the church is bigger than just the Catholic Church, perhaps? If that's the case, let me pause there. I think that's enough.
Yes to both of those questions. Okay. Yeah, short answer. Yeah, I will say that with the preface, though, I do think the Catholic ones have more scrutiny in terms of having to go through like panels, at least the confirmed ones, panels of doctors who review it. So in that case, they might not be as well tested. But in terms of documentary evidence, I think there's a handful of ones. The closest parallel I think you have in the Protestant cases are ones from like GMRI, which is the Global Medical Research Institute, and they're doing like on the Pentecostal level what the Catholics are doing, where they're taking cases and getting medical documentation. I interviewed one guy who was one of the cases of that who was healed. It's actually just published in a medical journal. Granted, it was like an alternative medicine journal, but the documentation is there if you want to look at it. It was really interesting about gastroparesis. Name was Chris Gunderson. But yeah, Candy and Josh Brown are the ones from Indiana University who are doing a lot of the work on the Pentecostal area right now in terms of documenting that stuff. There's also a good book. I have it. See, I got all my books ready in advance, which is nice.
Nice.
This one's a little bit older. It was from the 70s, but it's still a pretty useful one called, oh, hold on. This doesn't have the title on there. Called, you can tell it's from the 70s by the font, but called Miracles. And this is by a Richard Kazdorf.
That is a 70s font.
Yeah, it definitely is. But it's from the 70s. But I don't know if you've ever heard of Catherine Coleman before, but she was a pretty well-known faith healer back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And there was an investigator who went to one of her healing services, and he took a random sample of 10 people and followed up on them, and none of the, and he was a doctor, by the way, and he concluded none of them had been like really healed. And then her critics pushed back, or sorry, her supporters pushed back and said, well, first of all, you only took one sample from like one show, and you didn't like follow up on some of the other ones. And so Kazdorf, in response to that, wrote a book. Kazdorf was also a doctor, where he gave 10 cases where people really were healed, and he had medical. So he had cases like that. And what's helpful is he actually provides like a lot of the initial documentation on there. So if I can flip to some of them, like this is a case of a girl named Lisa Larios who had pelvic sarcoma, which is a kind of hip cancer, which was instantaneously healed. She was able to walk for the first time after going to a Coleman conference, and that bone actually had regenerated as well. There was another case, hold on, did I pass it up on here? Another case that I've talked about on Braxton's channel about Dolores, I think Winder was her name, who had a very severe case of osteoporosis in her early 30s. There was a bad quality x-ray. It's going to be hard to see on there in her body cast. She'd had that, I think, for 20, 30 years, had multiple surgeries. Her spine kept popping out of place. And after she went to Coleman's conference, not only did she was able to get out of the brace and stuff like that, but the bone was mended back together for the first time in that kind of way. So he has a couple really interesting cases like that. I don't think all of them in there are the best, but there are a few that I've like, oh, that's really, really compelling. And that was reviewed by, I think, 10 different doctors. He had to look at it before he published it in terms of verifying x-rays and stuff like that. So that's like an example of the Protestant aspect that you can see. So,
and that seems problematic for any kind of exclusivistic understanding of, I guess, well, any religion really, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know many Catholics who say God doesn't heal Protestants, right? I think they would just say, well, but these don't affirm any particular Protestant doctrine, right? It's just the healing in general. It's like, yeah, but if you're associating with like a preacher like Coleman or something who's not preaching Catholicism, is that not a vindication of their ministry? Like if, I don't know, if Benny Hinn heals someone, is that person not going to be more dedicated to thinking that Benny Hinn's a legitimate prophet, or like, you know, when people were healed by Jesus, that was meant to bolster his ministry. So it seems hard to separate that from the context of it. I would think so.
It also strikes me as just super weird for God to heal somebody of their, you know, cancer or whatever, and then to send them to hell once they finally do die because they had the wrong understanding of, you know, whatever. Like
she kind of implicated because it's like, I'm sorry for thinking that. It's like, oh, you know, you believed in Catholicism, you were wrong, even though you went to Lourdes and were healed and you thought the Virgin Mary did it. And I healed you knowing that you were going to think that.
That's right.
You were there. But, you know, it's like, aren't you just promoting these people to put their foot in the ground and be even more persistent that, oh, I experienced a miracle when I prayed to Mary or whatever, or this person, like, they're going to double down. That's not going to like help not convince them. So yeah, I agree that God would just be enabling them at that point and
right.
encouraging them to come to
what would God say like at the judgment? Would it be like, oh, you took your miracle healing at Lourdes as a vindication that Catholicism is true? Oh, sorry. That seems problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. So yeah, that's a fair point.
Okay.
So I talk about resurrections, you said?
Yes, and I don't want to keep you here literally all night. So if we don't spend forever on resurrections, that's totally fine. But I think it's worth touching on at least a little bit. Yeah,
and I'll just, for the sake of speed, there was, as I think you know, in Cameron's channel, I went over one particular case that probably one of the best ones that I know of in Nigeria. I actually brought it up when I was debating Matt Dillahunty, funny enough, on the resurrection, and he made a whole video responding to it. So that was interesting if you saw that. So I recommend looking at Dillahunty's response in the video and all that stuff. And I go into great detail, like probably 10 to 12 pages, probably too much detail to be honest, about all the different theories one could have and the theological implications, because I still don't really know what to think of it in terms of my theology and all that stuff. But the case on Cameron's channel, just to give the short version, was a man in Nigeria, a pastor who got in a car accident, was declared dead, was then taken to a mortuary where he was partially embalmed. They injected the formaldehyde and stuff in his body, had rigor mortis. But the family had visions that he was going to be raised from the dead, and so they took the body that night, and that Sunday morning took it to a church. The church didn't want them to have the body in there, but they take it downstairs and they pray for it. And after a few hours, life starts to come back to the body, starts to breathe. Someone pulls out a camcorder and they get some footage of this. It was back in 2001, so they still have camcorders. And eventually the guy came back to life. He was in a little bit of a dazed state. It took him about a day or two to get back on his feet, but recovered from that. And as far as I know, that's the only case of someone who was not only pronounced dead, which people can mistakenly do, right? But when you have the addition of the formaldehyde and the embalming, that's, if they weren't dead initially, it's a lot harder to do that with the addition of that. You think they'd be dead. There's another one I actually just recently added that was also in Africa in the 80s. It wasn't, I think it was in the Congo though, of a boy who was 6 years old who was paralyzed from cerebral malaria, which is like one of the most severe things you can get in Africa, leading cause of child disability there. And by the time they got him to the doctor, he had been killed. And just to make sure that he was dead, they prodded him and they took fire and burnt some of his legs and had no reaction. So they were pretty confident he was dead, but he's unconscious. But it's the timing of it, if it's instantaneous, and also if the disease that they had that killed them, quote unquote, killed them, also went away. That's what's surprising, right? Because you could have someone who's in a coma and is prayed for, and in a few days he gets better and all that stuff, right? But you not only do you have someone getting better at the moment of prayer from a distance, but you also have the disease showing no signs of neurological deficit, which you probably have if you were in that deep of a coma, and also having no signs of the original disease, which is also surprising because you have to explain how the disease went away simultaneous with that. So I think when you have a case like that where it's someone's dead and they not only come back at the moment of prayer without convalescence, but they don't have any neurological deficit and the disease that killed them was also gone, that's, I think, when you combine all that together, makes it a little bit more difficult to sort of explain in that way.
Do you know of any resurrection cases not from the continent of Africa? Just this is not a setup. This is just me being curious.
Yeah, although I don't know there. A lot of them I wouldn't call a resurrection. Like there's one with by a guy named Chauncey Crandall. It's relatively well known. Keener talks about it, of a guy who was dead for 40 minutes and his fingers were turning black. But then after someone prayed for him, they went and got a defibrillator and he came back. And he was clinically dead. That was in Florida, I think. But that's one where it's like, okay, that was in a hospital though, and if someone's dead for 40 minutes, that's when it's like, okay, are they really dead though? You and I would both be more impressed if it was someone who, as we said, was either embalmed or was a rotted corpse where it was no question, or decapitated, was very clearly dead, and not someone who's well, they stopped breathing and maybe they're dead, maybe they're not. And it could theoretically come back from that. So yeah, there are cases like that in the US, but I don't think they're nearly as compelling for that reason.
And I did watch Matt Dillahunty's response to your points about the case in Africa, and
yeah.
I must not have been paying that close attention to Matt Dillahunty's video. Was his point that he thought that the whole thing was a purposeful fraud? They tricked everybody?
I don't know. I couldn't tell what I think he was just throwing everything at the wall, because I think he implied that, but he also implied that he may have been unconscious and people thought he was dead and he wasn't. But as I said, I talk about all of those in the book in terms of why I think each of those is problematic.
Okay.
And I don't think purposeful fraud, that would be my first guess, but I think the way that it was done, first of all, it's the way that it's set up is weird. It's also because the pastor wasn't even there when he was raised. The one who said he'd already left at that point and it was at his church, but he didn't find out till later. So it's if this was a setup for ministry, it's weird that he didn't dramatically pray for him and have him in front of everyone. It's kind of an incidental thing, right? And also the guy, when he got better, he needed 2 days to recover, which is also not so why not just have him like that and in that kind of way, right? And the doctors and the facilities all have still held to their story and signed sworn statements, and these are are all named doctors and facilities, and none of them have retracted their story or said that. So, I mean, could they all be paid off? Theoretically, but the funny thing is there are other cases in Africa where they did fake something like that. But like there was one particular one in South Africa in 2019 that got memed because it was really badly done. But all the institutions in that case came out and said, "Oh, this guy was never in our funeral home.
Okay.
Yeah, his coworkers were like, oh, he was fine last week, like that." So like people came out and said something, but you don't have any of that for that case. And I don't think the whole he was mispronounced dead. I mean, that's initially plausible, but you have to not only with the embalming, but then the coincidence of people having a vision he was being raised from the dead, and then taking that, and then the original disease that he had, which was when he got internal hemorrhaging from the car accident, also went away. There's just a lot of factors about that. So I don't think any explanation I've seen so far was very convincing that I can tell.
Okay, cool. I would love to go through the epistemology of miracles with you. And if we need to do this a little bit briefly, just in the interest of time, that's totally fine. I have one question from the audience for you if we get there. Hopefully we do. If we don't, sorry, everybody. But this is where I think you and I might be able to have a little bit more back and forth, maybe, than we have up until this point. So I'm going to read my first question to you. In my script, I said, we just finished talking about healing. No, we just finished talking about resurrections. Bear with me. Pretend that we just finished talking about healing. I would like to present a hypothetical scenario to you. Imagine that all non-healing miracles were proven to be purely natural. So by the non-healing miracles, I'm referring not just to the miracle of the sun with Fatima, not just the Tilma, but imagine the Shroud of Turin. Imagine all these resurrections that we're talking about and the levitating saints. Imagine all of them were sufficiently proven to you to be natural. And I'm just asking you to give that to me just for the sake of this question.
Sure.
Not proving that I can do this.
Yeah, sure. Grant your argument. Yeah.
Grant all of this. The only miracles that remain now are the healings. Do you think that healings alone, given the amount of healings that we have and all that, would provide sufficient justification for belief in miracles or belief in the supernatural, or best yet, belief in God? Or do you think that healings alone would be insufficient? And I understand that this is a subjective question, because you might answer like, for me, yes, it would be enough. For somebody else, maybe not. But I am just asking you subjectively. By your lights, if there was only healings, do you think that you would be convinced that at least supernatural things happen?
I would say probably yes. And first of all, that's the vast majority of them. It's, over 98% of the Catholic canonization ones are healing. So the fact that a minority would not be legitimate doesn't do it. And I also just think that given God's nature of what we're predicting with the hypothesis is, you'd expect a lot more of those kinds of miracles, because other than the flashy ones like walking on water, turning water into wine, levitating, because those don't really help people. They're more just show-offy ones to vindicate a message. But I think there's a lot of emotional, and there's a lot of even theodicy aspects to it, where people who are suffering, who have their life dramatically changed after being healed, I think there's just a lot of beauty to that. And I think it makes more sense with a loving God that that's the kind of miracle he would probably be doing, because it helps more people than sort of being, it does the same thing that the flashy ones do, but I think it also has the benefit of being benevolent in that kind of way. So yeah, I think that would be sufficient.
So I agree with your whole big point about how like the healings just kind of seem more like what an all good God would do. Sometimes I laugh a little bit irreverently, perhaps, at like the idea that like an all powerful God would give a Tilma a heartbeat, where like if you would, but he won't.
Or would make a statue cry, right? Or that kind of thing, where like it seems like a very weird, or make crosses on show up on teeth, very weird things that God just happens to be in the business of. Yeah.
But I have a concern that I'd like to share with you and just kind of see what you think. Healings strike me as a lot trickier than something like a Tilma having a heartbeat. And what I mean by that is this. We are complicated creatures, we humans. And most of the miracles tend not to be limbs regrowing. That case from the 17th century notwithstanding. But with
literally standing because of the legs. Sorry,
that was a good one. I appreciated that, even if nobody else did. But But we're complicated. Atilma having a heartbeat is not. So I can imagine an argument, maybe not an argument, but I can imagine somebody doth complain that, oh, well, okay, the healings are getting a little bit of a free pass here because humans are really complicated, while Atilma having a heartbeat is not at all complicated and is easily falsifiable. Do you have any concerns there with how complicated we are, and how that might make the verification of healing miracles more difficult than the verification of Atilma having a heartbeat, for instance?
That's a good question. I think to some degree I would agree with you, but I'd also disagree in certain respects. So it depends on what it is. If it's something like a claim of, if we're talking about a historical claim, let me say. So I'm presuming we're talking about something that's not like repeatable, that you could just, all right, you can turn water into wine. Let's do it right now. Like this is like, oh, so and so turned water into wine, and I saw it, like that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That I think is a lot harder to investigate because it's like you don't know the conditions. But in the cases of healings, although the healing itself is not repeatable, I don't believe people can just every time do like that. I don't think virtually anyone does. Although the healing itself is not replicable, the pre and post conditions are. So the fact that the person had disease X for 20 years, anyone with a serious disease is going to see the doctor multiple times and be a patient and have a medical history, right? And so in that case, that was repeatable and investigatable under controlled conditions. They got scans, right, for years and years and years. And then when they're healed, we can repeat that. Okay, are they still healed? We can put them through whatever test. So I think in those cases, they actually are easier to verify in that way. All you have to do is prove the person really was sick with this and now really isn't. And we already have mechanisms of doing that. That's not controversial. That would hold up in any court of law in terms of medical malpractice. We do that all the time. The question I think you're asking is the explanation for it in terms of, is that because there are sort of parallels to that in nature, spontaneous remissions, placebo effects, does that hurt it? I think it could to a degree, but again, it depends on what the case is. So those criteria that I gave out earlier, the Lambertini criteria, were made with that in mind to say, okay, how does the human body work? Okay, take all of that and do the exact opposite of that. So human bodies typically heal over time gradually. Great, it has to be an instantaneous healing. Okay, typically it's a step-by-step process, has to be complete. Sometimes it relapses. Okay, fine, it has to be permanent. Sometimes it's psychosomatic, and that fine, has to be organic, nothing that the mind's going to affect. So you kind of put all these controls in place. And although I don't think it ever guarantees, I'm not saying it's 100% certain, I do think that we can, to a pretty safe degree, rule out all the known mechanisms that we have, at least in the way that we know them. So for me, to confirm a miracle, you would need two main things. One is that no natural mechanism exists, no plausible one, at least, that we know that would be adequate to explain the data. And two is that it occurred directly and exclusively within a religious context, right? So it happens either immediately or close to immediately, like after prayer or visit to a religious shrine or something like that. Now, what you could do to hurt my confidence, and this has happened before, if you could show an analogous case, and analogous, I mean, it has to fit those criteria. So I don't mean, oh, someone with multiple sclerosis happened to get better, because that does happen, but like they got better immediately in the same dramatic way that this person did, right? In a secular context, where now that's difficult to prove because people often pray for themselves and don't always report it. So sometimes it's hard to prove that the person wasn't prayed for, right? Because they don't usually say don't pray for them. But if you could show like adequate secular parallels to that, and let's say we didn't know the mechanism, I think that would still be good enough reason to hold with judgment on the miracle hypothesis. I would say, well, look, I don't know what this is, but the fact that we observe this in secular context means that there's probably likely some underlying thing that we just don't know. But if there's no natural explanation and the only time you see this is in religious context, I think that ups the ante on implying that the cause is something that's religiously oriented, right? And I've seen this because like there's a couple cases I know of juvenile macular degeneration, which causes blindness, hereditary. It's the genetic kind of it. Going away instantaneously in a patient. And when I was looking in the literature to find it, I was able to find another case of it happening, but it also happened after prayer. So the only cases I could find were analogous to that. There was actually a paper published as well of a case of Parkinson's going away in a dramatic way. And they say in a footnote, the only case I was able to find was one that was a Catholic canonization miracle. So it was basically analogous. It's like, well, that's the only other case you could find that like fits that. It's also in a prayer context. I do have to wonder why are these not happening more often in secular context, if that's the way. So if that's something that you could establish with a fair degree of probability, I think you have a good reason to think that we can infer a supernatural cause. That's one of the ways I would go about that, among others.
Cool. My next question for you has to do a little bit with the interaction problem. A common refrain from theists, and I picked on Eric Hernandez in this question. I wrote theists of the Eric Hernandez style.
Yeah.
A common refrain from those kinds of theists would be, um, God can't be proved through the empirical method, through science. It's simply the wrong tool. And I kind of wonder sometimes what Eric, perhaps, might think of everything that we've just been discussing today. Now, well, actually, I'm not sure. I imagine that a response from you or from Eric or something like that could be, none of this establishes God. All it's doing is establishing something beyond the natural, and that's all well and good. But I've got my question for you is, do you reject the common refrain, at least insofar as you think that we can prove that the laws of nature get suspended sometimes through the empirical method alone?
Do I think that we can show that the laws of nature get suspended occasionally through the empirical method alone? That's a tentative yes. I sometimes have an issue with the suspension language because,
Okay.
and I don't have a particular model in terms of like how this works, but there you could, and some people have argued this, you could say that perhaps, there are miracles like where God literally reaches in and abstracts that otherwise, right? Where it's like intervening in that kind of way. You have a wind up car and God puts his hand in front of it and stops it, like that kind of intervention. Or are miracles more like a timer, right? Where God creates the world and he has it to where without even having to like intervene, he says, okay, I'm going to create it, but I'm going to create it to where at 3 o'clock on this date, this atom's going to do this and this atom's going to do this and it's going to cause this result. Only that time though, or like only at that time. But it's like, as I said, it's like a timer. He has it set up to where at this time it'll do that. So it's not really an intervention. He does it at the start of creation. So I don't know which of those is correct, but in general, no, I don't think that's problematic. When we observe something that looks like it violates the laws of nature, I think there's three main options you can say. One is that this is a new law of nature, which we discover all the time. Unfortunately, if that's the theory, though, then you should be able to replicate that. So if it's a new law of nature, but that you can never replicate, that's probably not going to be most laws of nature. You have to be able to establish that again, right? So if you can't establish it through replicability, that's probably not the best one. So our other two options are that it was misreported, that we didn't actually observe it, that something just was observed wrong, someone made a mistake, reported inaccurately, which often happens, as we've discussed. Or the third option is that there was some contaminating feature that intervened, that was getting in the way of your data set. Some chemical might have slipped into this one, and that's why we got a different result. There's some outlier, right? And so for the skeptic, they might want to point to say, well, they weren't actually suspended and it was just misreported. And a theist might want to point to the third option to say, well, no, look, the laws of nature only apply in closed systems. So if we observe something that happens that's outside the laws of nature, we should say, okay, the preconditions were different in this case. And the preconditions would be that God intervened in this case, whereas he doesn't normally. So that's why this turned out different. But it's not it's not violating, gravity, because gravity only works if it's a closed system. I can violate gravity by catching a ball in the air. It's not violating the sense that you and I would think of it, but you get the point. So yeah, I don't see this as being a problem. But in terms of the interaction problem, which is the idea of how do we have an immaterial thing like the soul, usually is what it's talking about, interact with the physical, I would almost want to deny that distinction, because I think it's very difficult to even define natural or supernatural, right, for anyone in that particular way. So things have causal powers, and that's really how we define them. So whatever you think is the most fundamental thing in the universe, let's say it's a quark or energy or something like that, at some point you're going to have to just stop and say, this causes this, and that's why. There's no more, you can't have it be mechanisms all the way down unless you get infinite regress, right? So if you're going to say, okay, energy can do this property, and that's just how it is, there's no further explanation, they just interact in that way. That's fine. I think that's just what the theist is going to say with the soul or with God. That's just how it works. Yes, the material can interact with material, and we don't really need to go any further, because on the physical level, you have to basically do that on the atomic level anyway, in that way. And so, yeah, I don't even know what the natural even means. I guess you would say it's anything that's described by like the laws of physics. But again, the only distinction is that I think we're saying that there's something that's causally, both of them have causal powers, but the supernatural thing just has consciousness and intent and I guess free will. So that's really the only distinction between the causality of a mind versus the causality of the material.
Yeah. I would love to like dive into like interaction problems and stuff with you, but I have a few more questions. So in the interest of time,
Right.
a brief list of the miracles that we discussed today include the miracle of the sun, the tomb of Guadalupe, miracle healings at Lourdes, levitating medieval saints, and more. Are we sensing a theme? To me, and sure, I am biased, but I see an overwhelming skew towards Catholicism in the broader miracle landscape, if that makes sense. Do you see that kind of skew towards Catholicism as well? And if you do, is that a chip on the scale for Catholicism being the most correct form of Christianity?
Okay, yes to both of those questions, to a certain degree. It is true that in the Protestant Reformation, right, the reformers were generally cessationists. They didn't like the Catholic miracles. They denounced them, and the Catholics are like, "Well, hey, why do we have all the miracles and you don't? God's on our side, and He doesn't like you, right?" And even David Hume's famous essay against miracles, right? He's writing to an Anglican audience, and he gives examples of plenty of Catholic miracles that were contemporaneous at the time, who was like, "Oh, we have living witnesses, and you don't believe any of them, but you believe people from 2,000 years ago." So it's kind of funny how a lot of Protestants even today are really adherent to that and don't want to acknowledge that. But yeah, certainly do have a lot of Catholic theology ascribed. But again, when you have the Pentecostal movement in the early 1900s explode, and I really do mean explode because it's the biggest Christian denomination. It's also one of the youngest ones. It's only 100 years old or so, and it's already does the most mission work, is the biggest single denomination, excluding Catholicism, of that. And it's actually impressive how fast global Pentecostalism has been able to spread. So if you think that God's doing miracles behind that, then clearly God really wants Pentecostals to be successful mission and being missionaries to people. Whereas Catholicism, I think, is actually, I don't know, say, decreasing in numbers overall, at least in the West, of adherents. So the fact that Christianity has been spreading globally, mostly due to Pentecostalism, especially in developing countries, seems like God, as a Christian, I think God's clearly working through that. So it'd be really weird for me to say that. And often they're competing with Catholics, by the way. Like in Latin America, big Pentecostal movements growing, they're converting people who are otherwise Catholic. So if you think that those are miracles, then why would God be converting them outside of Catholicism, right? In that kind of way. So that is a weird dichotomy you have. So my general inclination to say, like, yes, I would be lying if I said that I didn't have serious considerations about the validity of Catholicism by looking at these miracles. It definitely, seeing pictures of what you think is the Virgin Mary in Zaytun does tip the scale a little bit. I mean,
well, that one's towards Orthodoxy, perhaps.
Well, okay, but it's a higher view of Mary at least, right?
Sure.
Maybe towards Orthodoxy, but she didn't, in that case, affirm a particular, like, this is true. But it regardless, combination of the other stuff does make you think, at least, about like whether you're wrong on that. And there's a lot of stakes to that because Pope Pius, the 10th, 11th, and when he declared the Assumption of Mary as dogma ex cathedra in 1950, said anyone who does not adhere to this will suffer the judgment of St. Peter and Paul or John on Judgment Day. So it's like, okay, well, if that's stakes, do I have to be Pascal here and try to wager if I should just accept that on faith or not based on that? So it's been a struggle for sure. And I know people, who I won't name, but maybe some bigger names on YouTube who have said that they think that this is pretty good evidence for Catholicism. So yeah, it does definitely swing me that direction, but the Pentecostal stuff swings me the other way as well. And so I find myself ending where I started, which is this sort of mere Christianity, non-denominational. God doesn't really care what denomination you are. He just wants Christianity to flourish kind of thing. And I think that's where I'm most comfortable with in that particular way. But if the question about why have Marian apparitions, for example, my educated guess that I've become comfortable with is to say that God wants to reinvigorate Christianity in these regions, but he does it in a way where it'll grow the fastest in a way that's familiar. So, for example, Pentecostalism has been able to adapt very easily to a lot of tribal religions, which is why it's very popular in Africa, and it mixes in with the culture. Whereas if you had something like, I don't know, Jehovah's Witnesses or something, it might be a lot harder to sell to that culture. So if you look at like Lourdes in France, this happened during the height of right after the French Revolution. Secularism was on the rise, rationality, a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment and stuff like that. So if you're going to get reinvigoration of the Christian faith in southern France, are you going to do it through the Protestant Reformations? Like, well, France has never really had a big Protestant presence, right? But Catholicism did. So I think reigniting those sort of dwindled candles is a lot easier than having to create a whole new structure from the bottom up to work with what you have. So I think that's why you have miracles in these regions, which are more Catholic friendly, and then in other regions, it's more Pentecostal friendly. God's working up from the structure that he has rather than having to start all over. And you even see that in the New Testament, right? Like when they try to adapt Judaism to the Gentiles to make it appealing to them, to be like, oh, you don't have to follow this law, you can do this. And Paul talks about the idol to the unknown God, and he uses the culture and tries to swing the gospel into it. I think that's what God's doing here with these miracles. He's taking the whatever form of Christianity they have that's closest to them at the time and is building off of that, because ultimately he just wants to get them the door. He doesn't care about them getting the exact right theology.
And just to add even like a little bit of more maybe credence to the whole like kind of culture mixing thing too, is Lourdes, like the actual apparition, incorporated a lot of like kind of like the pagan folklore.
You're saying that, yeah.
Yeah, like it's weird how Saint Bernadette was actually calling Our Lady Ekero, that one there, which is typically how they would refer to the forest pixies that were like part of kind of like the pagan folklore that was just in that part of rural mountainous France. And she also only appeared like the apparition of Our Lady of Lourdes was like this big. So
Yeah.
any statue that you see of Lourdes is entirely misleading. Like Bernadette herself was like 4 feet tall because she was a girl, like she was like 13 or whatever.
She happened to look a lot like the person she was appearing to. Yeah, as a white young European girl, very short, very very young,
but like unnaturally short. Like I think that she only appeared to be like 2 feet tall.
I didn't know that. But
Yeah.
that's yeah.
And she had flowers on her feet, which was like another like kind of forest fairy thing.
Well, same with the Guadalupe too, because she looked not only
Yes.
like a Latina woman, but a lot of the symbols and colors in the tilma are like based off of the Aztec kind of mythology with like the birds and stuff like that. So you have a lot of that incorporation too.
Yeah, and that might only kind of go to further your whole point about cultural. I almost said like appropriation. I don't know if that's the right term, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, further is my point, but if you're a skeptic, you could also say, well, look, it's not surprising that these come out of the cultures that already sort of encourage this belief, right? It's not like it's a radically new belief that you'd expect if these were man-made to kind of come out of pre-existing things. So I'm not saying that that itself is evidence for their being true. It's just my way of thinking that that's a plausible interpretation of the data, especially when you have other kinds of things. Now, we didn't have time to get into this, but I will have in volume 1, I have a few chapters on Christophanies, Jesus appearing to people. And there's always an unstated, I say it's like sort of an unstated secret or thing about, Muslims having dreams of Jesus. I feel like every Christian's heard this, but there hasn't been much written on it. I was surprised why. But in those cases, I do think it's really interesting because you see a lot of consistency across cultures in terms of in Africa, Asia, all these areas of people seeing Jesus, and he looks relatively consistent across all of them. And I compare that to the Marian apparitions in other cases, and I think that's really interesting that Jesus is pretty consistent, and you don't have a lot of the cultural influences in those cases that you do with the Marian stuff. Because in the Quran, or at least in the Hadiths, Jesus is described as having red hair, and he wears like a saffron yellowish kind of robe when he's coming down. But most of the Muslims who see him wearing white, and is sort of how he looks like in the Transfiguration or like in Revelation, white with radiance. Same within India and in Hindu countries where most holy men typically have orangish color robes and the gods are blue with multiple arms, that kind of way. I'm surprised at how consistent they are. Whereas with Marian apparitions, as you point out, they are much more divergent in terms of the culture aspect. So I think that's really interesting, but I talk more about it in the book.
Cool. And one last note here too is your point about how the skeptics might point to that same data and then say that it supports the skeptic case. I do fall on that side, but I think importantly, where you and I can agree is, I think that that data might equally well support the skeptical case. The case that you make, where it's not exclusivistic, but that data does not support exclusivistic religions. So the kind of trad cat understanding of Catholicism isn't really well supported by that data, which.
Yeah. Well, no, and I will say, I think it supports Christian exclusivism, but not to the degree that Catholic exclusivism, right?
Yes.
Because you don't have, there are, we didn't have time to get into this, but there are plenty of miracle claims in other religions. I'm not disputing that, obviously. I don't think they're as well documented, but even if I put that aside, Christianity has always used miracles for evangelism purposes, even in its early days, right? And they're vast amounts of people, and Keener does a lot of work on this, who convert because they believe they've seen a religion. That's why they convert to Christianity, especially in the third world. But in most other religions, miracles don't really, they happen to audiences who already, like in like Hinduism, most of the gurus are people who already believe in that and who are reporting it. You don't have like a lot of outsiders who leave their religion to convert to Hinduism because they saw a guru do some weird thing, right? So Christianity is not the only religion with miracle claims, obviously, but they are probably the only religion who can say that a substantial portion of their conversions were due to belief in miracles. I think that does kind of count against some pluralistic interpretations of religion. But you are right that I don't think it points to any particular denomination. So I don't go that far in the buck. So I kind of meet in the middle.
Yeah, yeah. And that was my point too. I was agreeing with you there. Sure. Christian
Right.
exclusivism, but not one denomination.
Not denominational
Yeah.
exclusivism.
I had one question left, but what I'll do is I'll take a few audience questions and then probably call it there. Unless you have a really strong desire, and I think these will be quick anyway. So Daniel wants to know if you think that bodily resurrection means physical resurrection. And then I think the subtext here is, could bodily mean spiritual resurrection only? Because Father Raymond Brown, the Catholic author, had fairly progressive views on what the resurrection might be.
Yeah, so I think resurrection, the Jewish term apotheosis, was, anastasis. That's the term. Means like to stand up. It was always viewed in a bodily way, right? And so I know Brown and a couple others would argue against that, but I think Gundry probably did the most Gundry and Wright probably the most comprehensive defenses of that, where I think regardless of what you think actually happened, the Christians believed Jesus was raised in a body. Now, what that means is a little disputed because, he can be touched and eat fish, but he can also vanish and appear and walk through walls in John. So what that means is very up in the air in terms of what's meant by physical there. But I do think that the traditional Christian belief that they held to was the body that was in the tomb was brought back to life and is no longer in the tomb, and the body in the tomb is the same. Maybe it's gotten a new makeover, but an upgrade, but it's the same body that he had while on earth, but just enhanced, basically. So it's not a discarding the body. It's not the soul leaving the body, because the Jews believed in the soul, or at least some of them did at that time. So there would have been a different way of saying that, but resurrection was very physical in that kind of description. You have and like some of the apocalyptic literature, the bones would be sewing together, like very, very gory, almost zombie-like descriptions of the resurrection. Some Jewish texts, it was very bodily description.
Cool. Two more questions from the audience for you. Have you looked into Gabor, and that's either Mate or perhaps like Mate's work on the mind-body relationship?
I have not, but I think philosophy of mind is a great area to look into. I probably will do that whenever I'm done with this project, which will be a couple of years from now. But yeah, no, I have not at this moment, but I'm sure it's pretty good.
Cool. Last question. Are Christian miracle claims stronger from an epistemological perspective due to the underlying agent compared to the miracle claims of other theistic systems?
I'm not sure what underlying agent, in terms of like God being the agent, and that's why it's more credible.
I'm imagining that the question is something like this. Would a miracle claim that has some kind of like not a deistic God, like a theistic God, would that be more likely than miracle claims from something like perhaps Hinduism, where, they have gods, but the Hindu gods aren't necessarily like acting with the same agency, perhaps?
Yeah, it depends, because I think in Buddhism and Hinduism, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of that's achieved when you get into sort of meditative states like nirvana or something like that, where like Tibetan Buddhists have some of this, where allegedly they can do things when they reach a certain mental state of freeing themselves from desires and all this stuff. And it's sort of like it's almost like a superpower, right? It's not like a God intervening and granting them this. It's more of like I've unlocked this code in myself because I put away all my desires or whatever. That's kind of how they view miracles in that way. But yes, the traditional monotheistic view is of this more intervention kind of perspective. And I think that way would make more sense under theism or a perfect being theism, I should say, than deism, because deism, I don't think, makes any predictions in terms of whether God gives a whatever about humanity. In fact, a lot of the critics of miracles were deists and not atheists back in the 1700s, right? I think Voltaire and some others like that, where they're like, oh yeah, maybe there's a creator God, but he doesn't care about religion's all BS and no one cares about people. So yeah, deism was actually pretty opposed. Spinoza was another example, opposed to miracle claims in that way. So yes, I think if you're going to say that there's a God out there who is all good, who might want to communicate a particular message to people in that way, I think miracles are predicted under that theory to a certain degree.
Awesome. Um, my final question for the evening is the classic final question, which is just, and I know that we have some links in the description down below. Where can we find you? Where can we buy your books? And what do you have going on next? Like, what are you working on that you're very excited about? And before you answer those, if you wanted to either, I guess, ask me any questions, because I did all the asking questions tonight, feel
Yeah.
free. Or if you have any kind of like final statement that you'd like to make, feel free to make that at this point.
Yeah, Kevin, what's your next video idea? What are you
Levitating
doing?
Saints now. No. Um I will tell you that I actually have two scripts in the works. One of them is you probably aren't aware of this, but a new Catholic like website was just launched called the Trad Recovery Apostolate
Oh
or something
no.
like that. Um and it's for people like me perhaps, where, well, not like I'm past recovering at this point, but but it's for people who so okay, I was strong armed into a marriage when I was 22, because
Gosh.
yeah, it was this crazy whole big thing. um uh and it's because of the culture that I grew up in. Trad culture is like very it's crazy, man. It's crazy. Um,
Yeah.
and so this group of ex trads who are still Catholic, they're just no longer so radical. Um, they're putting on a conference for like, hey, how to stop being trad without completely losing your faith, which is what happened to me. I stopped being trad and I stopped being Catholic altogether. So this apostle is trying to be like, hey, how do we people who get hurt by the trad movement, how do we help them without them losing their faith? Well, I guess the trads don't really like this apostolate because they're like, well, traditionalism isn't something that you need to recover from. This is insulting. Um, and
Yeah, they hate progressivism in a way. It's like, how dare you? Yeah,
exactly.
they.
Yeah.
I don't. Maybe they're not so much in the camp like, oh, Vatican II is of the devil. They're not that far, but a lot of
Some of them
them
are. A lot of them
some of
are.
them, yeah, some of them, like, how dare you say anything good about Protestants and all this?
Right.
It should be in Latin and very conservative with views of marriage and all that. And I'm not bashing them because I have tried Catholic friends, but I get it. Like it, I'm glad I was never raised in that environment, and I don't think I look. I'm blatant in saying that I don't want Catholicism to be true, at least that particular aspect of it. And does that inform my biases of how I look at these? Absolutely, it does. I completely admit that. But I also think I'm more open minded than most Protestants are about that. But there's a lot of conservative things about Catholicism that I don't like, not only just because of the strictness, as you said, but I think it also inhibits one's ability to discover kind of their own theology in that way, where there's a set of beliefs that you are told, like, well, you know what, it's nice that you might think that, but catechism so and so says this, so that ends any discussion. It's not I miss the intellectual pursuit of having interesting ideas to bounce off of where we can have legitimate disagreements, and it's not well, the dogma says this, so you have to hold to this regardless. So I get that, but sorry, you were finishing your point on
No,
that.
I was just going to agree with you. I get in trouble sometimes for saying this, but I hold, and I like, I'm sorry if this comes off as rude, but I believe that this is true. Catholicism is anti-intellectual.
Mm.
It exports your belief formation to dogmatization of things that should not be dogmatized, and I just find that to be like a real shame. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so that's the one, and then the other script that I'm working on is like a UFO thing, and also like, are we justified in believing in certain like Marian apparitions without also believing in UFOs? Like, what if the evidence for a certain
Oh,
UFO is better than the evidence for Guadalupe? Like,
yeah, there's a couple. I mean, if you know the Lonnie Zamora case, that's probably one of the most interesting ones I know of, and I think Jimmy Akin probably did a show on it once. But yeah, there's a handful of them I think are really like hard to explain away in terms of UFO stuff, but it's fascinating. So that's awesome. Are you doing a show on the Shroud of Turin? I thought I saw that as a thumbnail with Dale.
yes. So I did a video on the Shroud of Turin like over a year ago at this point, I think. Um,
Hmm.
and Dale and I are friends, but somehow we've never been on each other's shows. So he's coming on my show on Wednesday, so in 2 days, and we're gonna review my old Shroud video. I think that I stand by all of that stuff still. However,
Yeah.
let's see if I still stand by it after Dale is done picking through it, because he's a real subject matter expert and all that stuff.
Dale is like the equivalent for me, but instead of miracles, it's the shroud turn. Like that is
Yes.
his area, and he knows way more. I don't talk about it in the book because, frankly, it would, if I was going to cover it thoroughly, it would take way too freaking long. I mean, there's just so much. I'm actually impressed with how much has been published on it. Like it's kind of
Yeah.
overwhelming, and so there's just so much where I just admit, like, look, I'm not going to do this. But if you want my short interpretation, and Dale knows this, I don't think the shroud turn is authentic. I'm sorry. I don't know how the image got on there. I think it is genuinely impressive, and I've been puzzling in terms of the image formation. But and I know the dating is in dispute, and there's a lot of response to that. But I think the combination for me of the reference of it to the Middle Ages, like 1300s, the first unambiguous reference to it at least, and the fact that that lines up with all the dating, to me seems like a pretty big death blow. I mean, like it's again, I know that all that's in dispute and debated, and it's very, very complicated, but I think that until that can be decisively ruled out on both ends, I'm just gonna tentatively probably reject it.
Obviously,
But I could be wrong on that.
Yeah. And of course, I agree with you. And I think another point that I want to just throw in there too, super briefly, is that ever since that first carbon dating, the church has not allowed it to be carbon dated again.
Yeah, and then people have disputed the carbon dating, and that's when it gets to. And granted, there have been some reputable laboratories that have disputed it, but that's kind of the shame, is that when you take out a piece of it, you can't reuse it. So it's like there's only so much. Same with the I think I know we didn't get into this, the Eucharist miracles too, right? Like I don't think once they've had the people look in the laboratory, they don't like open this up to anyone who wants to come and inspect it. Like once it's there, it's like, okay, no more examinations. It's not as open to the public anymore. It's not open to like scientific review at that point. It's like, okay, no more inquiries. We've got the data we need. Because, and I get it, it's like, you only have so much of a wafer, and it's the body of Christ, and it would be so disrespectful to do that. But yeah, from a scientific standpoint, it is disappointing that there's not more and more replicability, right? Because you'll have people who publish things like on the shroud, or they'll make claims, and when other people look at it, it's like, actually, that's not what that is. That's not AB blood. That what you think is pollen really isn't, or something like that. And there's a lot of feedback. But with some of the stuff like the Eucharist miracles, you really don't have widespread publication where people can look at this and criticize it, and then they can look at it for themselves and come to that. Usually it's sort of just, well, here's my observations, and you're kind of just taking their word for it without necessarily critiquing it. So
here are my observations published in a pamphlet. Like it's so bad. Like it's
Lanciano, I think, was published in a medical journal, but most of them were not published in that. But no, I take your point. But anyway, I know we're concluding this, so we could talk for 5 more hours, I'm sure, on all. It's great. Maybe another show sometime, who knows? But
that'd be awesome.
No, it's great. Yeah.
So
anyway, sorry, the question you asked me though about my stuff. So yeah, you had said books on Amazon. Undead is the resurrection book, and Searching for a Solution to Suffering is the Odyssey book. I'm currently working on 2-volume big work right now. That probably won't be out till volume 1 will hopefully be out this year. Volume 2 hopefully next year. Called Proving Prayer. It's the tentative title. So keep a lookout for that. Just follow me on Facebook, social media. I'll be announcing all of those. Check me out on other channels. I do occasionally write for the blog Think Christian Theism as a guest. So I have a couple posts on the resurrection, on miracles, on that, if you're curious of anything that was discussed today. So yeah.
Caleb, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And like you said, I could go for another 5 hours, but I'm cutting myself off here. I'd love to do this again sometime.
I appreciate that, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me. This was a great experience.
It was. Thanks again. Thanks everybody in the audience for sticking around, and until next time.